The sealed file. I can't say when the beginning began, when my fingers touched the frayed cloth tie, or when the vent changed cadence like a second chest inhaling the room. On the gray archival lid, Vertralich had faded to brick red. The board's edges were chipped like fish scales. I tugged. The box exhaled barely. The smell that rose wasn't quite mildew or rust, more like rainwater left too long in a heavy coat. The first sheet was an intake slip, March 12, 2007. The typewriter had hammered the date with parade ground regularity. Under petitioner, Professor Dr. Johann F., Department of Criminology. Beneath it, the mayor's signature in blue ink. The final stroke hooked down decisively, a finger stabbing through paper. On the right margin, a ghost smudge of a fingerprint. No complete loop, as if someone wiped it mid-sweep. I lifted my head. My reflection skimmed the glass like a thin oil. The room stayed still, but the fluorescent hum thinned out until it sounded like soft shoes crossing old boards, far away. I turned to the petition. Line 1. Clinical. Reconcile witness statements. Re-examine physicals with modern forensics. Line 2. Consider limited exhumation at Hinterkaifeck, subject to law. Line 3. Secure political, religious, community consent. 3 lines, 3 rivets pinning the page to the desk. But in the left margin, a darker, angrier pencil note, /tampering present. Check swap typestrip /. The hand had no patience. The hand knew where to look. I brought the paper closer and stalled. On a few words, the ink bled thicker at the edges, as if pressed again, later. A typewriter can't lie. People can, by feeding truth through the machine twice. The next item was a black and white photograph of the Hinterkaifeck farm. Spring grass nubbing through, the barn mouth a dark O, the farmhouse forehead cracked. On the back, a shaky pencil line. There's still noise in the attic. No date, no author. Just a sentence that seemed to fall out of a tired mouth. I slid my thumb down the photo's spine. The cold in my fingertips wasn't from paper. It was from whatever walked those rafters, pushing through gelatin and silver to get out. A thin divider listed suspect roster, 1922. Typed, clean margins. The 4th line was red inked out. Time had browned the red, and the struck-out family names still showed through like ribs under skin, an A beginning to surface. Paper clipped beside it, a fingerprint card, blurry, smudged edges. No match, reference set degraded. Someone had typed. The clip's teeth had rust-bitten the card, but the clip itself was new steel. Someone replaced the fastener long after the fact. A smeared print, a fresh clip, a redacted name. 3 neat explanations pre-staged for a question no one was supposed to ask. I flipped to 1955. The police chief's leather notebook. The son of the 1922 officer. Wore dark fingertip stains the way old would hold smoke. A page, dog-eared hard enough to click when I opened it. Justice isn't catching the killer. Justice is refusing to let them be forgotten. The script was tidy, but every final stroke thinned, as if the hand fell off a ledge. A line under that. Then smaller script, private as a whisper. There's still noise in the attic. He'd written for the file, then written for himself. 2 scripts stacked like a shunt, an extra vein pulling the heart back to an earlier rhythm. In the sentence I heard a door hush shut, a hat land on a rack, a file drift across wood, and the slow breath of a man who already knew he'd lost before finishing the line. A clipped column slid out, its back mummified in brittle brown tape. Ailing police chief picks at village wound. The ink's malice was sour on the air. Between the newsprint and the storage room damp, a thread of burnt paper. That public memory smell, the one you get when people warm their hands over someone else's name. The paper's edge nicked my finger. I flinched, and right then the ceiling made a single, clean creak. The archive has no attic. I know that. Still, the sound found the place my memory hides. I set the column down and counted breaths. The second hand hopped 3 ticks. No follow-up creak. Some rooms know how to answer with silence. Johann's 2007 proposal was procedural muscle. Digitize and normalize witness statements. Quantify contradictions across redrafts. Drain sentiment through charts. Seek kinship DNA, if any bone fragments survived. The letters were sane. The page edges weren't. A hair-thin blade had skated from science to community and stopped at consent, as if it didn't dare cut into flesh. In blue pen, different from the earlier pencil, a small, Where'd at? Maybe Skip? The question mark bent on itself. A bead of ink dropped and glued itself to a land registry number from 1997 in a separate appendix, as if pointing. Land. I hauled up resources, parcels. The cover showed 2 ownership changes in the 1990s. Inside, Hinterkaifeck's boundary line nerve tracked a scrubwood, veered at a ditch, and kissed a weird little triangle plot. A pencil note. Triangle not present on 1954 map. A red circle around 1997. A pencil arrow at the name of a charitable trust. That same anonymous pencil, the one ahead of me in the stacks. I thanked them under my breath. The ghostly docent who'd stitched a hidden map into the cardstock. A 2007 cuttings sheaf rode the back. Bavaria's haunted farm. Forensics versus folklore. Mayor and the 3-generation curse. Sharp headlines. Cold grammar. In the mess, a religious weekly. Do not disturb the dead. Italicized, tilted like a hand brushing yours away. Another piece argued salt mine and old wounds, diagramming how the fields overlapped a nearby extraction lease. At the bottom corner, a tiny pencil arrow. Check Central Registry, June 1997 transfer file. I overlaid the clipping on the cadastral plan, the lead traced tight, a trap set for someone else's bait. The anonymous letter lived in an unlabeled manila. White sheet, typed. No prints. No lazy folds. Stop. Leave it. If you dig, the ground will dig you back. The syntax strained, like a native speaker mimicking a different dialect. The signature block read, "The Keeper of Keys." The chill wasn't the threat, it was the phrase. I'd seen it before, in a 1955 index slip. I paged the leather book, there it was. Same capitalization. Same staged piety. 2 dates, 1 voice. Or a tradition of threatening. In case photos, there was a rarity. The police chief, 1955, leaning on the Rathaus facade, hands half-pocketed. Big brow, deep-set eyes, mouth thin as a paring knife. On the back, in pencil, there's still noise in the attic. Third artifact. Third hand. Same sentence. Repetition doesn't prove truth, but it does prove survival. I sat and let the words hum up the desk leg into my spine. The 1922 scene log, Xeroxed, said, "No weapon recovered." Underneath, the seal integrity column got an OK stamp. The loop on the side table told a different story. Seal paper fiber didn't match era. The adhesive fluoresced like a 1990s binder. Someone had opened and resealed, maybe twice, not out of curiosity, but to eat a tiny thing. A print card, a mud note, a single vowel in a name. I wrote in pencil, the way the others had. Not to certify reality, only to leave a faint "I saw this." For short lines along the margin. Overlay type, seams where new text replaced old. New clip on an old fingerprint card. Wrong era seal adhesive. Keeper of Keys, repeats in 1955 and 2007. For corners shimmed under a tilted table, level enough to see the tilt for what it was. I opened Johann FS operational plan. Scan, cross-compare, seek exhumation, coordinate with environmental records, consult the church. The steps stood like trail posts. Between consult church and exhumation, a blue pen detour arced. Skip for now. Skipping isn't cowardice. It's a survival instinct once you've priced the toll. But dodging the church to reach the earth only trades one wall for another. People wall for stone wall. Down the corridor, wind threaded a window seam and pulled a ragged cloud across the light. I thought I'd stood up. I hadn't. The shadow of my hand stretched and recoiled, breathing under the glass. In that pulse, the scraps began to magnetize. 1,997 parcel transfers, mine expansion, charitable trust flush, with cash morality editorials timed to the day, the anonymous letter reissued in a familiar voice. The pencil arrows, left by a stranger years ago, knitted themselves into a road. Not to whoever swung the axe, but to whoever controls the valve, regulating how much memory the village is allowed to feel. I dipped into incidents. A thin slip read, "Bone sample tag, missing, warehouse, undetermined." Under it, recommend camera review, retention less than 30 days. A perfect loop, evidence that ages slower than the machine that could have remembered it. A slanted italic in the notes, can't confirm accident versus intent. Someone had penciled over it, quiet and decisive intent. I read it aloud, a whisper without a mouth. Back to the barn photo. For bodies stacked, straw heaped in humps. Today the picture smelled of sun-dried straw, not damp. Memory changes seasons to hide itself. I flipped it again. There's still noise in the attic. The ceiling gave me a second pinprick creak. No attic, sure, but plenty of history. History's a gifted mimic of architecture. At the bottom of the international cuttings, the Bavarian blood farm. Cool, touristy prose. In the margin, someone had inked 3 little check boxes, each a question. Why doesn't the seal match era? Who overtyped the petition? Why did the 1955 phrase reappear in 2007? I ticked all 3. It felt like standing at the foot of a staircase I'd seen twice. The first man never climbed. The second did and got pushed back. This time there was no staircase at all, only the sound. Some investigations don't ask where's the weapon, they ask who edited the sentence. Some murders don't need a living culprit, only a living custodian of the story. I reshuffled the file by a different law, not chronology, but sound. Attic creak, tampered seal, new clip, repeating phrase, 1997 transfer, recycled threat. When the scraps sat shoulder to shoulder, a shape surfaced, a labyrinth not built in earth but pressed into paper. Each page a wall, each pencil mark a crack. This maze didn't demand running. It demanded reading all the way through. I closed the box, then reopened it. Paper shivered across the desk like drum skin to a stray breeze. Somewhere close, a breath fell in step with the second hand. I didn't turn. Not fear, recognition. The haunting didn't live in ghosts but in tiny misalignments. A fresh clip on a ruined card, a scalpel scratch across science, a wrong glue under a seal, a half-cleaned fingerprint. Each sliver small, each sliver nudging the story half a millimeter sideways. Enough millimeters, and you end up in a different forest altogether. I wrote one more line in pencil, so faint I could barely read it. If you can't find the killer, catch the one editing the story. Catching won't jail anyone, but it might pry open a door. Old crimes don't need full daylight. They only need a slit wide enough for one eye. The rest, later hands will widen. I slid back the operations plan. Johann's blueprint. Digitize, compare, exhume, coordinate, consult clergy. Steps like pickets. Between consult clergy and dig, the blue-inked detour. Skip? I underlined it. Skipping wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. Yet skipping a wall of men only to slam into a wall of stone. How different was that, really? The hall exhaled. A seam in the window frame caught wind, bending a cloud. My hand's shadow swelled and shrank on the table glass like a lung. In that pulse, the timeline knots tightened. 1997 Land Transfer Mine Trust coffers moral op-eds, recycled threats. The scribbler of arrows, long gone, had done me the courtesy of setting breadcrumbs. Together the arrows drew a road, not to the axe bearer, but to the valve turner. The one metering out how much memory the village could drink. I bent back into incidents. A memo. Bone sample tag missing. Warehouse. Unknown. Below. Check surveillance. Retention less than 30 days. A noose. Proof always aging slower than the machine meant to remember it. Italic side. Can't confirm accident versus intent. And pencil, quiet but firm, leaned in taint. The difference between oversight and sabotage collapsed to a stroke of graphite. I looked again at the barn photo. For bodies under straw, their contours lumpy, wrong. Today the smell was sun-baked straw, not wet. Memory swaps seasons to camouflage itself. On the back, there's still noise in the attic. The ceiling above me pin-ticked once more, faint as a sewing needle. No attic in this archive, but history itself loves a disguise. Another clipping at the bottom, the Bavarian blood farm. The prose was glossy, lurid. In the margin, 3 squares drawn in pen, each labeled with a question. Why the seal out of era? Who overtyped the petition? Why repeat a 1955 phrase in 2007? I checked all 3. Felt like standing at a staircase for the 3rd time. First man never climbed, second man shoved back, third man finding only the echo of wood. Some cases never ask where's the axe. They ask who spliced the paragraph. Some crimes don't need a killer alive, just a curator breathing. At the bottom of the stack, what I thought was packing board shifted. It wasn't plain, it was grainy like old tracing paper. I lifted it. A translucent sheet fluttered free, inked with a 1922 farm plan in oxidized blue. Embossed faint at the bottom, Dienstbrach, nur intern, for internal use. Certain boundary lines had been overwritten later in black ballpoint, drawn so tight they eclipsed the original lines. Whoever did it knew exactly what they meant to cover. I overlaid the 1997 cadastral map with a clear butterfly clip. The corners aligned too perfectly, except for one glitch, a half-millimeter offset at the triangle plot that didn't exist in 1954. That hairline gap flickered under oblique light, where the residue of peeled adhesive glowed dull. At the triangle's center, a square ghost patch, paler than the sheet, just big enough for a passport photo. But the photo was missing, which meant something once sat glued there, until someone decided it couldn't stay. Who? What? If it was a face, why pin it to land? If an object, why crown it at the farm's navel? My fingertip brushed a dried grain of glue still clinging. It caught the lamplight and gleamed like an insect's eye. I reached deeper and felt heft where there shouldn't be. A thin sleeve labeled Audio Annex. Inside, not tape, but a smoky mini CD. Case torn. Label handwritten. March 18th, 2007/stack. Reading room /012 to 024. 12 minutes. No player here, but stapled to it, the tech log. Paper rustle, chair scrape, phone vibrate. 017. Sound consistent with attic creak. Reading room has no attic. A final note. Mic positioned at air duct. I looked up. The black vent grid breathed dust. Midnight 17 seconds. The creak had slipped through ductwork, migrating from 1922 to 2007 like a parasite. The entry log came next. A neat column of dates, signatures, card IDs. Noon, evening, night. Then a strange row. March 18th, 2007/2348/open, unassigned. In the margin, reader malfunction. Yet the power log showed the reading room lights active from 2349 to 031, bright long before any name was entered. Light was here before the body. A room switched on without permission. My palm pressed the desk. Cold. Not the air's chill, but the kind that clings to a key slot waiting for a name. In the carbon copies, a sheet from 1922 had a slip still fused. I teased it free, dust flaked like rain. Beneath, two verbs misaligned with the official copy. Heard had been rewritten as was told. Went up became intended to go up. Action to intention. Movement to hesitation. In 2 words, an alibi. A postcard fell next. A church printed on the front, on the back, shaky blue ink. Please don't force us. H. Dated March 10th, 2007. But the postal code was stamped by a sorter machine retired in 2003. Either someone kept old hardware, or someone hoarded old time. The lone ledger showed 2 scrawls. The police chief in 1955, the mayor's security code in 2007. Sandwiched between them, 1 purple stamp, absurd, December 3rd, 2070. A leap 63 years too far, a wheel deliberately spun forward. The file itself had predicted a future. Seals, stamps, photos, each supposed to hold the past still. Yet each betrayed its own fracture. A red OK stamp pressed deep, metal die style. Archives had used rubber since the 70s. Unless someone went shopping for antique dies. Or unless they wanted a seal that sealed nothing but itself. A photo of the barn shimmered under magnification. In the lower corner, a second reflection. Not 1 camera, but 2. The shoulder of the hidden photographer showed plaid fabric, a heavy button, no uniform. A miner's jacket, a warehouse coat. A man in frame, absent from report. Even Johann's own field notebook cracked. Among method notes, a slip read. Typewriter switched font mid-page. I checked. True. At the very line that said consensus, the letters tightened into elite. No typewriter swaps font mid-sentence. Unless the page itself was spliced. The underline above it. A bandage over the surgery. I pulled another sheet. Key log service. March 18th, 2007/2340. Spare key. Dachboden. Dachboden. Attic. This building has no attic. The signature belonged to a maintenance man who had retired in 2004. Dead ink signed 3 years after its hand had stopped. The biological file whispered. Family DNA. Overlap in 4 households. Cannot exclude line A. In pencil, the familiar hand. Less important than who the village believes. Fear had its own peer review. I leaned back. eyes to the ceiling vent. A damp stain spread, the outline of wings. My hand on the glass desk steamed, a line of condensation erode. At its end, 3 signatures glowed faintly. 1922, 1955, 2007. 3 watermarks stacked in time. Then a brown coin envelope slid from under a folder. A Pfennig, 1950, rolled onto the glass with a bright ting. Warm, not from my hand, but as if fresh from another pocket. Scribbled on the envelope, reading room floor. Someone had bent last night to pick it up. Someone was here. I stacked the scraps, whispering to myself as tally. Map with ghost photo square. Mini CD with attic creak. Entry light before entry name. Carbon sheet. Act turned into intention. Postcard dated after its own machinery. Seal pressed by the wrong century. Second camera hidden in reflection. Font swap midline. Key issued by a retired hand. All enough to hook, not enough to convict. Yet each microslip was a switch rail, sending the story down a different track. I scrawled a 5-point outline on a note card. 1. Tampered text. Type. Carbon. Overprint. 2. Tampered evidence. Seals. Clips. Overlays. 3. Tampered time. Lights. Stamps. Sorters. 4. Attic motif. Ductwork carrying ghosts. 5. Keys. Always returning. Always to the attic. I pocketed the card. Not for proof. For survival. For when the maze tried to erase me the way it had erased men before. Before sealing the box, I slid the lone Pfennig into the CD sleeve. Paper can be erased, metal remembers. I turned off the lamp. In darkness, the 017 creak no longer belonged to the disc. It belonged between my ribs. The corridor outside smelled of damp stone. Clouds leaned low, black as a roof beam. And as I stepped into the night, the wind flipped like a page, sharp, sudden. Not solved, not even close. But I'd learned the only rule that mattered in this labyrinth. Don't chase the killer. Chase the edits. The RE investigation project. I hadn't escaped the paper maze. Every time I set a file down, my fingers found another binder and cracked it open, as if there were still a vein inside that hadn't finished bleeding. And there it was, a new spine, a new cover, and underneath it, type that thickened into walls and corridors until the room around me felt smaller than the world the pages were building. This wasn't a stack of fragments anymore. It was a project, a reinvestigation plan, as careful as a surgeon's stitch and just as shaky as a dulled blade. Professor Johann F.'s report opened with dry academic scaffolding, modern forensics, data normalization, and interdisciplinary task force. But within a few lines, the voice shifted. He wasn't writing to colleagues anymore. He was talking to himself, or to the generations tethered to this curse. No case truly closes. It's only shelved in the dark, waiting for another pair of eyes brave enough to look. The sentence didn't belong to one man. It sounded like a chorus, 1955's father, 1922's grandfather, layered into one breath that wouldn't let your lungs fill. In the list of essential stakeholders, the first name wasn't a scientist. It was the mayor, the signatory on the sealed file. The tone changed again. Each letter felt heavier, as if ink had been poured with lead. On paper, he was the project's political patron. Between the lines, I heard an SOS. Only administrative power could shield the team from the spears already raised. Because around Hinterkaifeck there weren't just the barn's old ghosts. There was a web of interest strung across Bavaria in 2007, so tight it hummed. The appendix mapped out the stakeholders. The words were clinical, the images were not. The local church, note, strong social force, likely to oppose exhumation. I didn't just read it. I heard morning bells lifting off wet stone, shoes scraping brick, the parish priest, now venerated, speaking in a voice that was warm and granite at once. I saw a procession cut across the square, a crucifix like a blade pointing into a sky the color of pewter. The margin advised, do not reopen wounds, pray for peace. Peace for whom? The dead, or those who preferred the truth sealed beneath them? Next, industry, the salt mine. The word salt looked harmless in print. Stare long enough and it becomes crystals, white, sharp, stinging your eyes. I saw underground maps, tunnels like arteries, land contracts signed in basements, damp or on steel, and a voice in a dark hall whispering, not land, revenue. An old clipping ghosted up in my memory. The Grubers had fought over boundary lines. Did salt prime the blade in 1922? If soil was salted with blood then, who swore profit wasn't being irrigated with the same? Press. The column leaned like a camera. Parallel pressure source. Expose or exploit. Either way, it sells. In my head, midnight flashes, hard keystrokes, a cramped laugh. This will move copies. A headline, black and fat. The Blood Village of Bavaria, mystery rises. The homestead photo printed askew, like it had been dragged out of its grave. That cheap ink smell that sticks to your fingers and then to a town's memory, tattooing the story in all the wrong lines. Then the underworld. One cold word, mafia. I smelled cigar tar, heard the soft click of a lighter, the throat scrape of a laugh from the back table. Someone had scribbled at the margin, envelope or knife. Messy hand, message clear. A reporter pulled over at dusk, a sealed packet pushed into his pocket. Refuse it, and a headlight tail grows behind you all night. This wasn't just inquiry. It was walking into a night market where every stall sold fear. Half hidden in a sea of logistics, a sentence water-stained to near vanishing. Anonymous threat letter received. Cold air pooled around my ankles. I heard paper crease and a whisper lean close. Let the dead lie. The actual lines were short, blunt. Whoever digs, earth will swallow. Not law, not even a promise. A superstition weaponized. 1955 had its anonymous letters, too. Equally sparse, equally hollow, and somehow heavier than a blade. Weeds, back every season. Public sentiment. A tiny survey, but it roared in my head. Half the village said leave the dead in peace. Half said truth must be told. I saw a market hush when one voice rose too high. A door slamming on a reporter. An elderly woman's whisper, brittle as bone. Say their name and rain will come. A crowd in front of the church, candles lifted, the flame equal parts mercy and warning. That crowd didn't need a culprit. It needed silence. Silence is the simplest lock. It kept this case in a box for nearly 100 years. When I finally looked up, the board had said itself. Church, moral fortress. Industry, salt veins running under every field. Media, a knife with two edges. Mafia, a shadow without a silhouette. Villagers, both victims and wardens. And in the middle, a single bold name. The mayor, son of the 1955 police chief. Grandson of the 1922 officer. A straight wire pulled taut from the blood-soaked barn to a 2007 council desk. Now that the file was open, the wire tightened, around his throat and the projects. It hit me. I wasn't just reading a plan. I was reading a trap. Every party had hidden teeth, and the moment the team stepped forward, something would close. Science, reason, justice, labels you print on the lid of a box. Beneath it, bramble. And those thorns weren't only for the investigators. They pricked the reader, too, for daring, in 2007, to pry the lid again. The room went quiet, but inside my head a band struck up. Bells, drills, camera flashes, a low smoker's chuckle, candle fat snapping in a breeze, and across it all, the shuffle above an old barn. The project had barely begun, and already it felt like a noose. At the bottom of the stack sat a sheet with a coffee-stained corner. Project kickoff schedule. Reading it was like stepping down a warped wooden stair. Review surviving witnesses, standardized legacy forensics, closed-door meetings with the church, the press, the mine. Prepare to excavate Hinterkaifeck. The print was calm. The tread groaned. Every step warned. Witness review. A list of names, most of them bent by age. I could smell nicotine seeping from curtains, hear the wheeze at the end of a sentence. That night, I heard, but who would say? They weren't afraid of the killer anymore. They were afraid of the village, its eyes, its choir, its hunger for quiet. Memory was a rag, thin, stained, and the team was about to pull. Legacy forensics. Short phrase, long dread. A dehumidified room. Fabric evidence turned to dust, planks with dark weathered spots. Latex gloves lifting a splinter the way you lift a rib. Johann's line. Most physical evidence is gone. Photographs, diagrams, and autopsy notes remain. 3 moments braided. 1922's nib scratching paper, 1955's sigh as a file reopened, and 2007's mouse clicks spinning the past into code. 3 sounds twisted into one rope. Consult the church. Red underline, like a wound. The parish priest of 1922 had been canonized. That halo had hardened into a shield. I heard processional drums, waxlight flickering like 1,000 angry eyes. The church wasn't only opposing shovels, it was opposing questions. Every question was a cut to a saint's image. To the devout, that cut was worse than murder. Manage the press. The memo said, keep it measured, avoid sensation. But headlines were already baited hooks, shiny sharp. Truth or three-generation circus? Readership rose, nuance sank. Justice got recast as spectacle before anyone could dust a photograph. Exhumation prep. I froze like I'd stepped on a missing stair. A wild blanket of weeds. Beneath it, ash and bone. Beneath that, soil that never forgot. Digging wasn't about evidence. It was opening the community's storm cellar. Every spade would hit a nerve, religion, business, organized crime. Each of them screaming, not for justice, but for self-preservation. The risk analysis painted the rest. Anonymous threats. I heard envelopes slide under doors at midnight. Paper tearing. Steps retreating to gravel. Religious backlash. Candles lifted in their hundreds, binding the team in hymns instead of rope. Political pressure. End it or lose the chair. The rap of a gavel. The scrape of a vote. Corporate interference. Thick envelopes, mirrored sunglasses, a heavy ring tapping wood in rhythm. Community fracture. A narrow road. 2 rows of houses facing off like teeth wired shut. Dogs bark, windows slam, whispers travel faster than mail. Each line was a stone stacked onto the project's shoulders. The mayor bent beneath it, no longer just a politician, but the heir to 2 failed attempts, a 3rd generation stepping into the same thresher. When his pen touched the line, I heard metal kiss skin. Not ink. A wound. Johann's final note rang like a bell. If we fail, at least we tried. If we succeed, justice will have a chance after 85 years. I thought of the 1955 diary. Justice is not catching the killer. Justice is refusing to forget. 2 halves of the same shard, separated by half a century. Put together, they showed one face. Young officer, aging chief, torn mayor, and somewhere off to the side, my shadow slipped in without permission. I closed my eyes. The file kept talking anyway. Bugs at night, the town's low murmur, a late knock. This wasn't only science. It was a summoning. Pages as candles, signatures as prayers. But in that ritual, no one knew whether we were calling the spirit of justice or raising Hinterkaifeck's ghost again. I folded the schedule. The room went still. My mind didn't. I'd just watched a sealed archive turn into a battlefield. From here, justice, religion, money, power, and public hunger would charge each other like weather fronts. A boil already rolling. Old blood tacky. New blood likely. And the maze? It had opened. The only question left was who'd be brave or foolish enough to step in first, and who'd be swallowed next. The paper should have been dry, but as I turned the page, I felt it breathing. Each line carried the weight of a century pressing down, and when the new document unfolded, it was not just ink and margins anymore. It was a staircase, creaking beneath me, carrying me deeper into something that was already awake. The heading read, Schedule for the project launch. The typeface was bureaucratic, square, and cold, but the edges of the page were stained yellow, as if the sheet had once sat under a coffee cup that trembled with a hand that did not want to sign. Each date, each bullet point, had the sharpness of an iron nail. The first nail, review surviving witnesses. The second, standardize the old forensic files. The third, private meeting with church representatives. The fourth, controlled communication with the press. The last nail, the deepest, excavation of Hinterkaifeck soil. I let my eyes linger on the first nail, and suddenly the room was not paper anymore. It was a small house on the edge of a Bavarian village. The curtains were heavy with smoke, the wallpaper faded. An old man sat slouched in a chair, wheezing through what remained of his lungs. When the investigators asked, his voice was not words at first, but the rhythm of someone trying to push memory through a throat that had been shut for decades. That night, I did hear something, but who could I tell? His confession was not an answer, it was a survival tactic. A memory wrapped in fear, sealed tight, because even in old age he knew that opening his mouth would open the village against him. The schedule's second nail pierced deeper. Standardize old forensic records. The phrase looked sterile, But when I traced the words with my eyes, the walls shifted into a damp evidence room. The smell of mildew gnawing at cloth bags that held shards of wood, fragments of stained earth, photographs curled at the edges. Each artifact was touched 3 times. First in 1922 by trembling hands scribbling in candlelight, again in 1955 by the police chief, who couldn't escape his father's shadow, and now in 2007 by sterile gloves and the buzz of a flatbed scanner. 3 eras folded onto the same table. The past was not being reviewed. It was being resuscitated, jolted awake by electricity and the faint hum of a computer fan. Then the third nail, red-inked in the margin. Consultation with the church. My stomach tightened. Consultation was the word on paper. Confrontation was the word in the air. I could already hear the bells tolling, not gentle but iron-heavy, drowning every rational syllable. In my mind, the square filled with robed parishioners, candles flickering like eyes that judged, eyes that threatened. Somewhere, a statue of the canonized priest watched from his pedestal, his carved gaze angled heavenward, but I saw the shadow beneath his jaw tilt downward, directly toward the investigators. The note beside the line said simply, "Do not reopen wounds. Pray for peace." Peace for whom? The dead? Or the institution that had silenced them for nearly a century? The fourth nail was softer on the surface. Contact with the press, limited. But the word limited rang hollow. The press had already scented blood. I could almost hear the staccato bursts of camera flashes, feel the heat of cheap newsroom ink rubbing off onto fingers, see the sensational headline already drafted. Bavarian blood farm. 3 generations and a curse. The investigators wanted restraint, but the newspapers wanted spectacle. And in between those two hung the truth, dangling like a corpse between rope and gravity. And then, the final nail. Prepare for excavation. The word itself cracked like a shovel hitting stone. I saw the field, tall weeds bending under wind, earth hiding bones that had whispered to each other for 85 years. To dig was not just to disturb the soil. It was to break open a vault of collective memory that the village had agreed, silently, to keep sealed. Every thrust of a spade would not only unearth bone, but rip away the bandages that had allowed the community to pretend the wound had healed. What would surface would not be skeletons alone, but property disputes, shunned daughters, whispered scandals, land deeds traded for silence. The earth was not mute. It was waiting. At the back of the folder, a thin page trembled under the weight of the others. Risk assessment. The words were typed with the cold neutrality of bureaucracy, but reading them felt like standing at the center of a minefield. Anonymous threats. I could hear an envelope sliding under a door at midnight, paper creasing under a boot heel, the hiss of a whisper on the other side of a wall. Religious protest. The image erupted, hundreds kneeling on cobblestone, candles raised, chants swelling, not a hymn but a blockade of sound. Political pressure. A council chamber with shouting voices, gavels pounding, and one voice whispering behind the mayor's chair, "If you don't end this, neither your office nor your family will last." Corporate interference. A boardroom cloaked in smoke, a hand with a gold ring tapping the table in place of words, while a sealed envelope slid across the grain of the wood. Community division. A single dirt road, 2 rows of houses facing each other like clenched jaws, neighbors glaring, children pulled inside, dogs barking at the invisible fracture. Each risk was not a line on a chart. It was a noose tightening from 5 different directions. I imagined the mayor's shoulders bending under that weight. His pen hovered above the page, not writing but carving invisible scars into the air. He was not just a politician. He was the grandson of the officer who froze under the sound of footsteps above a farmhouse ceiling. The son of the police chief who wrote in his journal that justice was memory, not capture. 3 generations converged on the tip of his pen. When he signed, I swear I heard the faint rasp of a blade against skin. Not ink, not paper, something deeper. Professor Johann's note at the end should have sounded like optimism. If the project fails, at least we tried. If it succeeds, justice will have a chance after 85 years. But the words rang like a funeral bell. They echoed the 1955 entry. Justice is not catching the killer. Justice is refusing to let them be forgotten. 2 voices, half a century apart, yet the same desperation bleeding through. I stared at the sentence until it blurred, and behind the blur the faces merged. The trembling officer in 1922, the weary chief in 1955, the conflicted mayor in 2007. Their silhouettes overlapped until they became one faceless witness, looking directly at me, demanding whether I would dare write what they never could. The file ended there, but the silence afterward was heavier than any word. It was not silence of rest. It was silence of a stage, curtains drawn, actors waiting, audience holding breath. This was no project. It was a ritual. Each page a candle, each signature a prayer, each risk not a footnote, but a curse. And the deeper I read, the clearer it became. They were not trying to resurrect justice. They were summoning the ghost of Hinterkaifeck itself, pulling it into the present, binding the living to the dead. I closed the folder, but the creak of the staircase still followed me in the dark. The project was not an investigation. It was a trap, and anyone who stepped into it, witnesses, professors, journalists, priests, mayors, even me, sitting here now, was already tangled in the rope, waiting for the knot to tighten. The church in the saint's shadow. The folder was labeled plainly enough. Relations with the church, 2007. The words sat on the cardboard like nothing more than administrative shorthand, yet when I stared at them, they swelled into the outline of a heavy oak door. A church door, thick and ancient, iron hinges biting into stone. I reached toward the file, and in my mind the door creaked open. The archive around me dissolved. I was no longer at the reading table. I was stepping into a square lit by hundreds of candles, bells tolling, the air saturated with incense. The first page carried a line that was almost casual. Parish priest of 1922, canonized 1984. A single sentence, yet inside it I heard a century of silence. That man had walked through Hinterkaifeck in the days after the murders. He had heard the whispers about footsteps in the attic. He had counseled the villagers not to question, only to pray. His silence had once been hesitation, or perhaps complicity, but time had recast it. Decades later, the silence itself was sanctified. What was once omission had been sculpted into holiness. His absence of words had become a miracle. I saw the marble statue erected in front of the parish, serene face, eyes tilted toward heaven, robe cascading like water. The villagers passed beneath it, heads bowed, reverent. Yet as I stared, the stone eyes seemed to tilt downward, not toward heaven but toward the living, watching, judging, blocking. Behind the white glow of sanctity, there lurked a shadow thicker than any shroud. The report stated, in language drained of blood, local church opposes exhumation of Hinterkaifeck remains. Grounds: disrespect to the saint's legacy, destabilization of the community. I didn't just read the words, I heard them. The low murmur of a congregation kneeling, candles trembling in their hands, lips whispering prayers that, in my ears, reshaped into a single chorus, do not touch. Every flame was an eye, every hymn a warning. Justice, frail and flickering like a match in the investigator's hand, stood against a sea of candles, bright, vast, and mercilessly cold. An accompanying photograph was tucked inside, a procession from 2006. Hundreds dressed in white robes, church banners flaring in the wind. At the center, a statue of the priest borne on the shoulders of 12 young men, lifted like a relic, like a verdict. I studied the picture and knew immediately. This was not just religion. This was political muscle. This was collective authority dressed in sacred vestments. When the village carried the saint, they also carried silence, shouldering it through the streets, elevating it until it no longer looked like avoidance, but like doctrine. Drums pounded in the image. I could almost hear them. The chant swelled, swallowing every forensic question before it could be asked. A note from a closed-door council session was quoted. If exhumation proceeds, it will be regarded as an act against the church. One sentence, yet it landed like an iron gavel. I heard the echo of chains clanking shut, a steel door slamming. In that instant, the forensic team was no longer a panel of scientists. They were defendants. Their DNA kits were heretical instruments. Their microscopes, profanities. To the church's voice, they were not seekers of truth, they were desecrators. And in the logic of faith, desecration demands erasure. The report's social commentary section used one chilling phrase. Religious devotion has fused with collective memory of the crime, creating taboo. The word taboo loomed in my head like a carved door of stone, thick, marked with 1,000 crosses. There was no keyhole. The hinges groaned with the weight of eternity. Wind seeped through the cracks, but what lay inside was sealed black. The church had taken Hinterkaifeck and performed a reverse sacrament, not to save, but to bury. The silence of 1922 had been lifted, wrapped in white cloth, and placed on the altar. What had once been concealment now shone as humility. What had once strangled justice now shimmered as virtue. One annex to the file contained a clipped article from 2007. The village has transformed the murders into a religious myth. Every investigative attempt is regarded as an affront to the saint. As I read, I could hear another voice, the coarse laughter of men in a tavern. Justice? Don't joke. Around here, only miracles matter. And I saw it then, the contradiction embodied in flesh. Hands raised in prayer, but also raised as barricades. The invisible killer of 1922 had been replaced by a visible one, the congregation itself. Not one murderer, but hundreds of guardians of silence. Justice was not being stalked by a shadow. It was being strangled by a choir. The folder included reproductions of original 1922 police notes. One line, shaky but legible. Parish priest present at scene, gave no further statement. On the page, it looked innocuous. In my head, it detonated. He had known something. He had chosen silence. And silence, passed through decades of worship, had ossified into sainthood. What the law could not expose, liturgy had embalmed. I set the papers down, but in my skull the bells rang louder. Not bells of time, but bells of warning. This section of the file was not about bloodstains or fingerprints. It was about the white robe draped over them. The robe was so pure it blinded, and in that blinding purity, the crimson below could never be seen. In Hinterkaifeck's labyrinth, the walls were not only timber and soil. They were scripture. They were wax from candles. They were carved marble. And anyone who pressed too hard against those walls would not merely meet resistance. They would be branded as blasphemers. The last line of the file's report said it flat. If the investigators proceed with exhumation, expect potential social unrest. But unrest was too mild. What I saw in my mind's eye was a square packed with bodies, candles raised like spears, hymns chanted not as prayer, but as war songs. The documents described the canonization ceremony of 1984 as a source of local pride. Yet when I read it, the description unfolded into something heavier. I saw the day play out. Thousands streaming into the square, banners whipping, a carpet of white flowers laid before the church doors. But the flowers didn't look like purity to me. They looked like layered shrouds, stacked until they smothered every drop of blood still hidden in the ground. Canonization had not sanctified the priest. It had sealed the case. A marble lid on a coffin too dangerous to open. A clipping from the village paper was glued beside it. Silence can be holy. The phrase landed in my chest like ice water. Silence was not holy, it was vacancy. A hollow where truth had once echoed. But here, silence was being worshipped, elevated, defended with chants and processions. And the chant spread, not just through church pews, but through daily life. A whispered doctrine disguised as piety. He knew, but said nothing, because God knew already. That sentence rang in my skull like a curse. Because if the priest's silence was interpreted as sacred, then no testimony, no evidence, no forensic chart could ever compete. By 2007, the taboo had hardened like concrete. Any spade raised toward Hinterkaifeck soil would be seen as a blade aimed at the saint himself. There was a police report from that year attached. It didn't list suspects. It listed crowd control protocols. They had to consider that exhumation might trigger not a courtroom battle, but a riot. And then came the photographs. I slipped one from its sleeve. A religious procession in 2007. A tide of villagers in white robes, candles shaking, the statue of the saint lifted high. But the angle of the photo was telling. The camera had caught the moment from below, so the stone eyes of the statue didn't look heavenward. They looked straight out, at eye level. At the investigators. At me. The gaze was not gentle. It was granite. It was condemnation. The caption read simply, "Procession against the investigative project." I read the words, but in my head I heard the roar. Not gunfire. Not curses. But hymns, louder, faster, until the harmony fractured into something closer to a mob chant. Candles no longer glowed like soft halos. They flared like torches. Justice was not being debated here. Justice was being tried, and the verdict was already carved in marble: guilty. A handwritten margin note, shaky as if written under pressure, whispered the truth. We are not investigating against the church, but the church will see it as against them. That single sentence summed up the trap. Forensic science wasn't aimed at religion, but religion had chosen to stand in front of the graves like a shield, and any hand raised to brush away the dirt would be seen as a strike against faith itself. The record of a closed meeting between Johann's team and the diocese was chilling in its brevity. The church refuses cooperation, insists the matter rests with God. On paper, it looked like diplomacy. In reality, it was a stone wall. Rest with God meant, out of your hands. It meant, stop, or we will stop you. And in that room, I could hear the sounds: the scrape of wooden chairs, the swish of cassocks across polished floors, the dull boom of an organ cord vibrating through memory. The table between investigators and priests wasn't a table anymore. It was a tightrope stretched across a pit. The church had learned to transmute weakness into strength. The failure to speak in 1922 had been canonized. The failure to question had been ritualized. Every absence had been polished until it gleamed like virtue. And so, in 2007, to dig for truth was not simply an academic task. It was heresy. Another photo showed the square at night, hundreds holding candles, a flood of orange light. But the exposure of the camera blurred the faces. No individuals remained, just a mass of flame and shadow. A collective mask. From somewhere in that blur, a voice seemed to reach me. Touch the grave, and you touch God. The phrase wasn't printed anywhere, but it was written in the posture of every bowed head, in the rhythm of every footstep. Justice had become not a courtroom procedure, but a theological intrusion. And intruders are never forgiven. The file had a sidebar. The crowd regards exhumation as blasphemy, threatening the foundations of collective faith. I imagined Johann's team reading that line, late at night in a rented room, faces pale in the lamplight. They weren't planning an excavation anymore. They were planning a siege. Because against hundreds of villagers chanting in unison, DNA evidence was just a whisper in a storm. I closed my eyes, but the square didn't vanish. The hymn still rattled the glass inside my skull. The church had not erased Hinterkaifeck. It had absorbed it, metabolized it, rewritten it into liturgy. The crime had become scripture. The silence had become commandment. And any scientist foolish enough to break that commandment would find themselves staring into 1,000 blazing eyes, not of the dead, but of the living. And in that moment, I understood something raw. The investigators were not only hunting a murderer, they were trespassing on holy ground where murder itself had been turned into a relic. The last folder was heavier than the rest, its edges darkened as if wax had dripped across them. Across the top, stamped in bold, Religious Demonstrations, 2007. As soon as my eyes touched the title, the archive room fell away. I was back in the village square. A sea of white robes, banners cracking like whips, candles shaking in fists. The report described it clinically. Annual procession redirected into protest against investigative project. But nothing about it was clinical. I could hear the drums pounding, steady and merciless. I could feel the ground tremble beneath synchronized steps. The saint's statue towered above, caught in floodlights, its face carved into an eternal frown. The crowd sang hymns, but the rhythm was too sharp, too militant. This was no prayer. It was a verdict shouted in chorus. And every candle lifted high looked less like a beacon and more like an accusation. Thousands of tiny flames, all pointed at one thing: justice itself. The file noted, investigators received verbal hostility, accused of disturbing sacred memory. I didn't need the words. I could see it. Scientists pressed against the wall of the square, clutching folders and evidence bags like shields, faces pale as the wax dripping onto their shoes. They weren't researchers anymore. They were heretics standing trial. The crowd didn't chant the murderer's name. They didn't demand answers. They demanded silence. Don't dig. Don't open. Don't remember. 3 short commands, in tone like scripture. Louder than any data set, heavier than any lab result. The next photograph nearly stopped my breath. At first glance, it showed nothing more than candlelight blurring a sea of faces. But when I looked longer, the blur reshaped itself. The faces melted into other faces, ghosts of 1922, of 1955, of every failure before. The weary eyes of the old police chief, the trembling hands of the officer under the rafters, the bowed head of the mayor. They were no longer individuals. They were a congregation. And I, reader, witness, intruder, was swept into their rhythm. Even standing alone in the archive, I felt my feet echo their march. My lips almost shaped the hymns. The weight of unanimity was that strong. One handwritten annotation, crammed in the margin, broke the spell. The priest of 1922 may have known more, but his silence is now canonized. Canonized silence. The phrase curled around my spine like a cold rope. If that was true, then justice hadn't been strangled by a killer's hand. It had been buried beneath marble and incense, sealed by hymns, and defended by the living as though it were holy relic itself. And the most terrifying realization? That silence was untouchable. Because to question it was not to question a man. It was to question a saint. The report concluded with a final line. The project must prepare for intense confrontation with religious groups. But confrontation was a euphemism. What I saw, what the documents made me see, was a battlefield. Not soldiers, not weapons. A battlefield of candles, choirs, and stairs that could burn deeper than fire. Justice, in that square, shrank to the size of a matchstick. One breath from the crowd, and it would gutter out. I closed the folder, but the square didn't leave me. The hymn still surged through my chest. The saint's statue still towered above, glaring. The villagers' eyes still glowed like coals. And I understood then that the walls of the Hinterkaifeck labyrinth weren't just built of earth and secrecy. Some of them were made of scripture. And those walls were higher, stronger, and far more dangerous than any stone could ever be. Because to challenge a murderer was one thing, but to challenge a saint, that was to put your head in the noose and tighten the rope yourself. The salt mine, the blood mine. The label this time didn't name people. It named land. Salt mine, rights and disputes. The room changed smell as soon as I touched the folder. The paper-stale air pulled back and something warm and saline slid in. A briny tang that preserves and corrodes in the same breath. When the cover opened, the pages didn't lie flat. They buckled like strata. Blue lines slipped under black text, ISO contours, fault ticks, arrows tracking subsurface flow. In the crosshatch of symbols one place nearly disappeared, Hinterkaifeck. Beneath it, a pencil slash as thin as an unstitched wound. The file told a history with few words and too much meaning. Under the old order, salt rights traveled with the church. Salt belonged to the ground. Grace belonged to God. After the war, those rights shattered and ran through community foundations into friendly LLCs with names soft as December snow. Someone built a bridge from altar to boardroom with red seals and green bylaws. Footsteps across that bridge left salt dust. Salt rusts metal. Salt burns when it finds skin. A fat subdossier, land transfers, 1990 to 2001. Two-sided pages, print as small as ants. Black rectangles smothered names, accounts, sometimes even verbs. Stare long enough and the redactions lined up like headstones. A pencil in the margin tapped the dates, 1993, 1997, 2001. The question mark was pinprick small and still found the eye. I could hear the hush of closed-door meetings, chairs scuffing, fingertips drumming while someone chose which single word to place on a line. No murderer's name lived here. Only rings of signatures snug as oak growth. Each new ring shielding the storm that scarred the last. Between the cold legal pages, an ochred photocopy from 1921, a boundary memo. A few shaky lines in fog-pale ink. A corner marker shifted, the map redrawn, the field itself not yet. The name Gruber skimmed the margin like a hairline and vanished. A clerk added, indirectly touches the stable lot. Featherlight document, heavy consequence. If one boundary could slide on paper, another, between justice and interest, could slide to match. By 2007, the grammar changed. Monitoring wells. Threshold exceedances. Vertical leakage along fracture zone. Below the crude graphs, numbers meant nothing to outsiders and everything to me now. CL, SO4 superscript 2, total fay. In the gutter, blue pen ran a vertical note. Check discharge, line and delta. There it was again. Delta. I'd seen it stamped in the archive index, KZ Delta, scribbled beside the parish PA system, Heritage Fund 41 Delta. Now Delta was stapled to an outflow line. The symbol wandered the stacks quietly, from vault to church to the ground beneath both. News clippings slid out of Johann's report, salt and the shadow contract, old farm, new interests. Cheap ink bit the air with that metallic sour. One byline hid behind a pen name and a careful voice. Adjacent parcels flipped unusually fast. A permitting office dissolved. Minutes missing for a signed resolution. The prose accused no one and forced the eye to circle the dark halo around each stamp. In my head, shoes following someone into a late street, a camera firing inside a shut cab, a call cut to snow. A schematic unfurled, wells, runs, tanks. Dotted waypoints beaded the page, a few sitting directly under the old Hinterkaifeck block. The piping looked like a sleeping animal's arteries. Each beat was a tanker gliding past the village gate. Paint scrubbed white, cab polished clean, holds heavy. In the corner, a photo of a courteous gray ditch, like someone learned how to keep the truth from showing color. The lower edge was smeared with mud or with something you couldn't name. An inspector's pencil whispered, acrid odor, metallic on the tongue. I swallowed. My own tongue flashed iron. A 1997 registry page sprang loose. Names aligned like gravestones. The legal rep of a company that once sat on the parish council paused his pen just before the period, like ink feared drifting into the wrong jurisdiction. At the bottom, a familiar entry, a church-affiliated charity. The connection looked like twine, soft, pliable, exactly the kind that binds tighter than cable. The tracing ledger turned money into a children's Connect the Stars. Every star, a legal entity, every line of flow. At the village's center, a traffic loop with no entrance and no exit. Ask where funds start, and the map says, around you. In a corner box, someone wrote 2 dry words, clean through. No legend needed. A closed-door meeting memo between the project and the extraction firm read like frosted glass. Cooperate within the statute. Provide data as required. Respect community sentiment. Between the lines, I heard the polite clink of a knife on porcelain. An old ritual. Before you bargain, know who owns the table. A second hand had wedged a line at the bottom. Recommend pausing comms. Sweat, right there in the prose. Step back so you don't fall is still a kind of forward motion. A rusted staple locked down a strip of photos. Trucks at daybreak. A brushed silver sign for the works. A man smoking at the fence, his smoke peeling off like a second soul. The last shot was snatched from behind a tree. 2 rigs bumper to bumper at the fork, a flicker of metal between them, something passing hand to hand. A dog far off cocked an ear at a sound the camera couldn't catch. The prints stayed quiet like they'd sworn to. If you kept looking, they spoke. The cleanest moves are the ones that never take a name. Buried in a loose notebook were the team's private, breath-length entries. No letterhead, no titles, just hands. Salt keeps, and salt makes you remember. And this village has brined its memories so long that everything is tough now, fear included. The chapter's title wrote itself, the salt mine, the blood mine. The words kept trading places until they were the same thing. A stray press file on the young reporter chasing a leak, blacked out email headers, canceled meetings, tailed twice, car without plates. In the rear view, 2 lights stared back like an animal's eyes. The newsroom's internal note walked on eggshells, pivot coverage, suspend series, prioritize safety. The archive floor tilted a degree, careful, or the whole stack slides like dry snow. No police memo saves the reporter in this file. There's only white space. After white space comes silence. Another clipping reeked of machine oil, grave diggers for profit. A tidy braid of moralizing and mockery turned the investigators into bone pickers. A pale scrawl in the gutter tried to answer. Scientific purpose, data transparency. The ink looked like the breath of someone arguing past exhaustion. A rumor map bloomed like bindweed. Gruber and the marker, son-in-law, hired hand who knew too much. Permits and parish, company and charity, mafia and post-war loans. Each branch ended on a tiny dot labeled verify. Fireflies at the tree line. A forester knows not to chase every light. A file reader doesn't get that choice. Dates clicked. March 12th, 2007 archive intake. March 26th, first closed session. April 5th, anonymous letter. April 14th, short sit-down with the company. Minutes recorded, distance between chairs. The room's chill, a water glass set too near the edge. The acoustics of a negotiation that never stood up. Chairs sliding, air cold, water ready to spill. A tab stamped environmental incident. Secret flushed pink like a scar that still itches. Heavy metals over threshold in residential wells. Advised cautious messaging. The sentence lay smooth and cold, and my mouth tasted like I'd swallowed from the wrong bucket. Somewhere a dipper struck a ring against a well wall. Foam in the pail flashed metallic. A reader in 2007 worries about health. A reader stuck between pages hears 1922 echo back. If the salt vein is the money vein, did last year's boundary fight open the door to blood? I closed the first stack and the brine stayed in the room. Salt in the air, on the cuffs, on the tongue. Overhead, brown water lines crept along the ceiling, paint like a map of old leaks. In my head they weren't rain, they were brine wicking up from a shaft. Two flows crossing. At the junction, a single sound. No attic creak this time, just the soft crack of earth, enough to let the salt smell through. The folder wasn't just ledgers and runs. It was a contract the village never wrote down. Trade silence for steady paychecks. Trade ditch color for festival lights. Trade one big question for 1,000 easy ones. Justice stood like a vendor without a stall. No one shooed him. No one beckoned him. The wind in the alley smelled like salt, diesel, and a story that wants to be forgotten. When I pulled the folder back toward me, something heavy slipped loose. A thick sheaf of photographs, edges rusted with staples. First, a tanker crossing the village gate at dawn. The camera caught it mid-roll, chrome hubcaps still wet with dew. Second, a faded sign for the extraction zone, silver paint peeling into flakes that looked like bone. Third, a man leaning on the chain link, cigarette hanging loose, smoke drifting off like a shadow that didn't belong to him. And the last frame, blurred, hurried, snatched through tree branches. Two trucks tail-to-tail at the fork. Between them, a shimmer of something metallic passed hand to hand. A dog in the distance cocked its head, ears sharp to a sound the shutter couldn't capture. Silence is its own testimony. Look long enough, and the silence confesses. The cleanest exchanges are the ones no one dares to name. I flipped further, landing on property records, 1997. Neat rows of names. The kind of straightness you only see on tombstones. One company lawyer had once sat on the parish council. His signature trailed off mid-stroke, as if the pen itself didn't want to cross the boundary between civic duty and profit. At the bottom, in ink darker than the rest, appeared the name of a church charity. The connection was soft, string-like. But soft ties bind hardest, especially when no one wants to cut them. Then came the financial traceries. Lines in red and green arced like a child's connect-the-dots game. Only each dot was a corporate entity, and each line a money flow. In the center, a roundabout with no entrance, no exit. Ask, where did the funds originate? And the answer was, around you. In the corner box, a small note in pencil, laundered. Nothing more. A meeting transcript followed, formal, frosty, polite. Cooperate under statute. Provide data on schedule. Respect local sensitivities. Each line was like glass, transparent but cold. I could hear the faint clink of cutlery, an old ritual from before men shook hands. Before you bargain, know who set the table. And at the bottom, in a different hand, strongly advised delaying press release. The ink was sweat-stained. Step back, survive. That's progress of a kind. Among the folders, someone had slipped a young reporter's dossier. The journalist had been chasing rumors of effluent, property fraud, maybe both. His notes were all there. Emails with names blacked out. Appointments crossed through. A log, tailed twice, unmarked sedan. The last page, a photo in a rearview mirror, two lights floating behind like eyes of a predator. The newsroom memo was cautious to the point of cowardice. Reassign coverage, suspend series, prioritize safety. The archive floor seemed to can under me, as if one misstep would send every sheet slaloming like dry snow down a mountain. There was no police report to save the reporter here, just white space. And after white space, silence. Another clipping dripped with grease, tomb robbers for hire. An editorial that mocked the investigators as grave robbers, thrill chasers, profiteers. In the margin, a rebuttal was penciled faintly, for science, for transparency. The words looked like someone had run out of breath mid-argument. A whisper up against a wall of jeering headlines. I turned the page, and a rumor map spilled out like ivy. From a central circle marked Hinterkaifeck, lines branched everywhere. Gruber and the disputed boundary. Son-in-law resentments. A farmhand who knew too much. Permits wrapped around parish funds. Company directors and charity trustees. Mafia whispers and war loans. Each branch ended with a tiny dot labeled verify. It looked like a night sky of small stars, each one blinking on and off, each one impossible to chase at once. Dates lined up neatly on another sheet. March 12th, 2007, files received. March 26th, first closed-door session. April 5th, an anonymous letter. April 14th, a brief sit-down with company reps. The minutes didn't bother to record substance, just the distance between chairs, the chill of the room, a glass of water set too close to the edge. The acoustics of a negotiation that was never meant to succeed. Cold air, sliding chairs, a glass that nearly toppled but didn't. That balance is its own verdict. Then, stamped crimson, environmental incident, confidential. The red had faded pink, like a scar that still itches. Heavy metals detected in residential wells. Communications to be handled with utmost care. The sentence was smooth, but it tasted jagged. My mouth filled with that brassy tang like I'd swallowed the wrong cup. In my ear, a dipper struck the rim of a well, water foamed, and in the thin froth I saw the flash of iron. Someone reading in 2007 would think, health hazard. Someone like me, trapped between 1922 and 2007, thought instead, blood disguised as brine. And there it was again, the whisper of a pattern, a shifted line in 1921, a slaughter in 1922, philanthropy in 1955, accidents in the mine, anomalies in the wells. One vein, tapped again and again, like a wound kept open because it still paid dividends. I closed my eyes. The smell of salt didn't leave. It had settled into the hair, the cuffs, the very taste on the back of the tongue. And above me, the ceiling stains stretched like maps of unseen rivers. Brine running through stone, blood running through memory. And in the end, they were the same stream. The last folder in the stack bulged with witness files, absolute confidential. The paper inside was limp, warped as if sweat from nervous hands had soaked it. Each testimony was anonymized, numbered N1, N2, N3, faceless voices caught in a jar. N1. 2 trucks, no headlights, stopped near the oak. Heard the metallic slam of a door. Then silence. Afterwards, sulfur in the wind. N2. During the procession, I saw Mr. A, name blacked out, singing with the crowd. But his lips didn't match the hymn. I noticed a wire in his ear, looked like an earpiece. N3. My boy asked why the well water tasted of iron. I told him it was rust, but I knew the truth. 3 fragments, 3 dissonant notes. But dissonance reveals the hidden chord. A thin appendix followed. Unconfirmed disappearance of a mine worker, March 2007. No police report. No obituary. No grave. The line read, family received envelope. Told he had gone away. I heard the soft sigh of a suitcase snapping shut, sealing not clothes but a life. That man had been folded into the ledger, like salt into broth, dissolved until he was nothing but flavor in the silence. At the very back, a page of laboratory notes, soil samples from the barn site. Traces of industrial sodium chloride mixed with iron filings, carbon residue. Meaning, after the slaughter, someone salted the earth, literally, to bleach the blood, to prime the ground for a future mine. The killer may have only slain bodies, but those who came later murdered justice itself, mixing crime with commerce until no one could tell bone from brine. Pinned over that report was a municipal signature, the mayor's, not the steady calligraphy of bureaucracy but a cramped, trembling scrawl pressed so hard the ink had bled through. I had seen those hands before, in 1955, when his father signed a police log about a threatening letter. In 1922, when his grandfather tried to write the crime scene report with fingers shaking. 3 generations, 1 gesture, the pen that stabs paper like a blade stabbing air. The margins whispered a dialogue without speakers. The land must remain stable. The salt must remain steady. The blood has dried. But I knew better. Blood never dries. It seeps. It seasons. It lingers in the tongue of children sipping from the well. It hardens in the white crust on stones after the rain. I closed the dossier, but the room stayed salty. It had saturated the plaster, the rafters, the breath itself. My lungs stung as if they were lined with brine. And in that sting, I realized the lesson of this chapter. The village had learned to pickle its memory. Not to forget, but to preserve. To keep the wound forever edible, marketable, profitable. Salt keeps meat from rotting. Here, it kept silence from spoiling. As I stood, the floor beneath groaned. Not the attic creak of 1922, but the subterranean fracture of earth itself. A mine exhaling, a blood vein sighing. The sound of a land where history and profit had fused, where every grain of salt carried the taste of a throat cut long ago. And I understood. The next time anyone lifted a spade in Hinterkaifeck, it would not only dig into earth, it would puncture a vein, and whatever bled out would not stop at the soil. The press, the mafia, and the political game. The file was thin, its cover frayed like the eyelids of a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Across the front, a typewritten label, Press and Public Opinion, 2007. The moment I opened it, the archive room changed its voice. No longer quiet shelves and the hum of fluorescent lights. Now I heard the clatter of keyboards coming from nowhere, the endless whine of a printer forcing paper through its teeth, the shrill ring of a newsroom phone that no one would answer. The air smelled of reheated coffee and half-dry ink. Scraps of headlines littered the floor like autumn leaves, each one a failed attempt to weaponize curiosity. The first headline slapped me in the face. Hinterkaifeck, the case returns from the grave. The words were bold, black, and cruel, like salt rubbed into an unhealed wound. Beneath them, the same 6 bodies were resurrected again. The barn strewn with straw, the sound of footsteps in the attic, the axe no one ever found. The details had become charms, repeated until they no longer revealed the truth, only sold it. In the background, I could almost hear the newsroom's laughter. Which photo was creepier? Which phrase would make readers shiver harder? Which fact to cut so the story fit the layout? Truth was a skeleton. The flesh was supplied by editors. The lead photo showed the old farmhouse, its walls split like dry skin, weeds strangling the foundation. The camera tilted on purpose, turning the roof into the jawline of a grave. The caption sealed it, "The Haunted House." One phrase, and all investigation was suffocated. A haunting doesn't need a killer, it erases him. Another clipping cut sharper. Mayor's career to die with bloody case. I pictured his office at night. Desk lamp bleeding waxy light onto a pile of papers, and on top of them, that headline. He didn't read it. He measured the length of the word die against the shadow of his father, the police chief buried in 1955 after a lifetime of whispers. In one stroke, the press turned a generational wound into a weapon. At the back of the file was a stapled list, journalists assigned. One name underlined, a young investigative reporter, the same one who had broken stories about the salt mines. I saw his rented room, yellow lamp, ashtray full, notes taped to the wall. His pen scratched like he was holding back a river. Then, the note, series halted after 1 week. Personal reasons. 2 words as light as ash. Ash that covers everything. Behind them, a midnight knock, shoes waiting on the stairwell, a long breath held until dawn. The clippings grew inconsistent. One paper praised the project as a scientific opportunity. Another called it a waste of taxpayers' money. 2 scales tipping back and forth, but justice wasn't in either pan. Only circulation and ad revenue. A survey chart was taped in the margin. Half the public wanted the case closed forever. The other half demanded bones be dug until dust turned to evidence. I didn't hear percentages. I heard a half prayer, half market cry, sung together like a broken choir. In the middle, justice was just one faint note that never harmonized. A handwritten memo, several articles pulled after publication, possible financial pressure. I looked at the white gaps left on the page. They felt like unmarked gravestones. Above them, a phone kept ringing. At the other end, a voice too low for tape. "Stop asking." From that second, silence had a price tag. Then, In English, bold and brutal. The Bavarian blood farm. An export version of the nightmare. Somewhere far away, in a bar, strangers laughed over their drinks, turning 6 butchered lives into campfire entertainment. The village lost its story the moment the outside world bought it. In pencil, in the margin, the press is a double-edged blade. One side slices lies, the other carves justice into a spectacle. I could almost see the blade, polished, passed hand to hand. Everyone swore they held it for the greater good, but the cuts kept bleeding. Then the file darkened. A black cover, still reeking of fresh ink. Economic file, subject A. No name, just a letter. The first photo, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, red cloth slashed with gold scissors, flashbulbs like lightning. In the center, a smile built for billboards. His ring caught the light like a blade edge. The text worshipped him, business magnate, construction empire, philanthropist, pillar of the community. But between those glossy words, I heard something else. Coins clinking in donation jars like envelopes hitting a table, applause in conference halls echoing like gavels sealing deals. A confidential report, cold as winter stone. Subject A has maintained ties with organized crime syndicates since the 1980s. At once the smiling figure shifted. In my mind, he sat tapping his ring against wood, steady, patient. Each tap was an order, a nod, a verdict that never needed to be recorded. A newspaper supplement praised him as the man who built fortunes from salt and light. But I read the phrase crooked, salt mixed with blood. I imagined a wine glass lifted by a white-gloved hand, liquid shimmering between red and white, pink, the color of cover-ups. And then the sentence that froze my spine. Rumor. Subject A is the son of suspect number 4, 1922. The red thread stretched tight. From the barn floor to the boardroom carpet. From an accused farmhand to a celebrated tycoon. A genealogy written not in ink, but in erased police files and family silence. The old case file from 1922 had a shaky line. Suspect number 4, land dispute with Gruber family. No evidence. Name crossed out. But a crossed out name is not erased. It's just covered like a corpse under a sheet. The 1955 file repeated the whisper. Rumors of family involvement persist. Insufficient proof. That police chief, father of the current mayor, scratched the note himself. His hand shook, not just from age, but from knowing the stone of the church and the salt of the mines weighed against him. Now, in 2007, 3 words. A is suspect 4's son. The red thread wasn't just lineage. It was an umbilical cord, nourishing an empire with silence preserved in brine. A side note warned, if revealed, community may explode. And I heard the explosion, not from dynamite, but from faith and denial colliding. The entire village, ruled for generations by the shadow of a suspect, suddenly unmasked. Centuries of silence shattered in one gasp. Another report, a controls local press via advertising revenue. I saw the classified ads section bleed into the editorial column. The paper itself was a puppet, its strings pulled from A's office. A photograph showed him raising a glass at a private banquet, the mayor at his side. The mayor's lips pressed tight. His hand trembled as he clutched the stem of his glass. Between them lay a folded piece of paper, an agreement with no words written, only consequences. Beneath the table, I heard blood dripping like water. Finally, the coldest note of all, DNA trace from 1922 crime scene shows partial match to A's family line. Inconclusive. In my mind, the maze flared alive. Walls built of brick and blood, names of villagers etched faintly along the sides. One name carved deepest at the center. A. Whoever entered that maze burned their hands on his name. The next drawer was bound in rough twine, as if the archivist wanted to remind anyone opening it that ropes could still strangle. The tag read, Local Politics, Confidential. The first page was a council agenda, bland as boiled cabbage, until the final line. Hinterkaifeck, discussion deferred. The mayor's name was printed in bold across the top. In the margin, in pencil, 3 fronts of pressure, church, business, press. 3 hands pressing down on the back of one man's neck. A golden ring, a silver crucifix, a black headline, any one of them heavy enough. All 3 at once, bone-snapping. I imagined the mayor sitting at his kitchen table, not in chambers. Coffee untouched, A crayon drawing from his child pinned to the fridge, bright sun and stick figures. And across the table, a letter slid under his door. Resign or your family will pay. The file didn't reproduce the letter, only described it. But I could feel the weight of the knife balanced above the nursery crib. Another report. If inquiry continues, likelihood of losing seat. High. That chair in his office wasn't furniture anymore. It was a vice. Sit down, and the screws tighten. Stand up, and the whole machine crashes on your chest. The clippings attached to the back screamed, Hinterkaifeck, a political curse. The ink bled across the page like mold spreading in a damp room. I closed the folder for a second, but the curse clung to my skin. The next binder was heavier. A glossy spiral spine, cover stamped with a single word in blurred letters, Playbook. Inside, the strategies of Subject A. Not evidence. Not testimony. This was choreography. Page after page diagrammed the flow of information the way cartels diagrammed shipments. Arrows circled, triangles intersected. The first rule, cut leaks. Send lawyers to the newsroom. Threaten litigation until editors choke. The second rule, change the subject. Whenever blood threatened to surface, flood the press with charity. Announce scholarships, foundations, hospitals. Hide a corpse beneath a bouquet. The third, frame the morality. Don't argue facts. Argue faith. Brand any investigator as an enemy of the community, an insult to the church, a desecrator of memory. A perfect triangle. A closed system. Justice didn't even appear on the map. Then came the calendar. Glossy inserts listing photo ops, donation drives, and ribbon cuttings. The Gruber Memorial Scholarship. The Restoration Fund for the Parish Church. A seminar on ethics in journalism. All neatly scheduled to collide with court hearings, press conferences, or forensic reports. Every good deed timed like a counterpunch. One envelope held a CD labeled in blue marker, recording, editorial meeting. I didn't have the player, but the file contained a typed summary. A communications advisor from A's company sat with a newspaper's deputy editor. Verbs floated like bullets, explained risks, reminded of obligations to sponsors, suggested redirect to human interest, raised concerns about reporter safety. The transcript ended with silence prolonged, chair scraped, rhythmic tapping heard. I knew the rhythm. Ring against wood. The metronome of intimidation. Next came 2 screenshots. The paper's homepage, before and after. In the first, a bold headline. Salt mine scandal. Local business implicated. In the second, 1 hour later, it was gone. Replaced by a puff piece. It speaks on responsibility and hope. At the edge of the screenshot, a stray finger was visible, gripping the frame. Whoever captured it wanted proof. Proof that truth had a body, and it was being dragged off screen. The budget documents were almost comical. Spreadsheets mapping ad revenue to religious festivals. One column earmarked. Increased spend, Saints' Day procession. In the margin, one word scrawled, coverage. Not coverage of news. Coverage like a blanket, thick enough to smother. The section on online forums chilled me more. Screenshots of local message boards. Hundreds of comments, written in identical rhythms. Leave the graves in peace. Do not insult the saint. Do not disturb the town for glory. Different usernames, same sentences. At the corner of one screenshot, a handwritten note. Sock puppets, astroturf. Fake grass sprouting faster than real grass. Manufactured silence, choking out the genuine kind. Another page carried an incident report. The young reporter's car accident. Officially a mechanical failure. Lug nuts loosened after a tire change. On a rainy night, the car skidded and rolled. No fatalities, just bruises and fear. The note from his editor was blunt. Reassigned subject. No further pursuit. No one wrote the word attack. They didn't need to. The oil slick on the road said enough. And then, something different. A Polaroid photograph fell from the folder. Yellowed, edges curling. It showed a brick wall, a makeshift altar, and a single sheet of paper nailed in place with an iron tack. The image was too distant to read the paper. But on the back of the photo, in pencil, a message. Don't forget the side archive. Marked with a cross near the shelf. A crude arrow pointed right. The chill hit my spine. I remembered the note in the church annex report. One cabinet found empty. No details, just empty. Now the Polaroid whispered a location. A secret file, tucked away, disguised as a devotion. The game shifted. This wasn't just pressure and propaganda anymore. Someone, inside the system, wanted me to see. The rest of the binder returned to routine. Talking points for press conferences, scripted answers for Q&As, the choreography of denial. But the final handwritten note stopped me cold. Release, and the community explodes. Hide it, and the conscience explodes. Underneath, a horizontal line, then nothing. As if the hand that wrote it trembled, paused, and never finished. I stared at that blank space longer than any headline. Because it wasn't silence. It was a wound still open. By now the archive room had settled again into its false stillness. But in my ears, the newsroom still buzzed, the wine glass still clinked, the ring still tapped wood. This was no longer a murder file. It was a ledger of compromises. Each entry a trade, a bribe, a silence, a scapegoat. The killer might have swung the axe in 1922, but by 2007, entire institutions had learned how to wield the shadow of that axe like a tool. And me? I wasn't reading anymore. I was standing at the crossroads of three forces. The church, cloaking silence and sanctity. The mafia, laundering blood into salt and gold. The press, turning justice into spectacle. The mayor was trapped under all three. But so was I. Because once you've read the Polaroid, once you've seen the margin notes, you don't walk out clean. I laid the Polaroid on top of the DNA report. Image above evidence, myth above science. It felt wrong. But maybe wrong was the only way to be honest. The file snapped shut like a stage curtain dropping. Yet behind it, I knew the strings still vibrated. The play wasn't over. And the door marked with a cross, the one no one was supposed to open, waited for me. The photo stayed in my palm long after the rest of the papers slid back into their folders. That Polaroid, with its faint altar and nail-pin note, pulsed like a second heart. A message from someone who wanted me to follow the trail. Not to the headlines, not to the mayor's speeches, but to the place marked with a cross. I looked around the archive. Rows of shelves leaning like tired men, spines of binders mottled with mildew. The fluorescent tubes above buzzed in fits, turning the room into a flicker book where every object jumped when the light stuttered. It smelled of paper rot, dust, and something sharper, like stone wet with brine. In the corner, near the wall that still bore water stains shaped like crooked wings, I saw it. A cabinet lower than the rest, its wood darker, its metal latch nicked and pitted. On its edge, almost invisible unless the light struck right, someone had scraped a cross. Not carved with devotion, but with impatience. A single downward slash, a hasty crossbar. The sort of mark you'd make if you needed to hide something and didn't want to forget where. My throat dried as I knelt. The latch was stiff, resisting like an old tooth in its socket. It gave with a groan, and the door swung open on hinges that shrieked too loud for a room this secret. Inside was a single box, wrapped not in twine, but in what looked like a strip of priest stole, violet once, now faded to ash gray. The label on the box read only, supplemental, not for circulation. I lifted the lid. The first page hit like a hammer. A transcript from 1922. Notes on an interrogation of Suspect 4. The same man whose bloodline later gave rise to Subject A. Back then, he was just a farmer locked in a feud over land boundaries. His name penciled faintly in shaky German script. But the kicker was at the bottom. Alibi provided by parish priest. No documentation. Statement accepted. No documentation. Just faith. One man's word had sealed the crack, and with it, perhaps the truth. I turned the page, my fingers leaving damp smudges. A family tree drawn in ink stretched across decades. Names inked, then crossed, then reappearing under new corporate entities. Next to some branches, tiny notes. Loan forgiven, land ceded, married into council. At the bottom of the tree, in bold red pen, A. It wasn't genealogy. It was a ledger of power. Bloodline translated into boardroom. The next file was stranger, a typed draft of a speech never delivered. The mayor's hand scrawled notes in the margins. We cannot bury justice for another generation. Crossed out. The evidence does not condemn an entire family. Crossed out. The truth belongs to the people. Crossed out, underlined twice. The speech ended halfway through, abandoned. Like a man rehearsing a confession he knew he'd never give. Attached was a report from security services, heightened risk of unrest if familial connection made public. Recommendation, suppress. The word suppress carried no emotion, just a scalpel. I dug deeper. A cassette tape labeled in biro, hallway, council building, March 4th, 07. The transcript beside it read, unidentified voice 1. If you push this, you won't just lose your chair. You'll lose the town. Voice 2, mayor, and if I don't. Voice 1, then you'll lose yourself. The tape ended with the sound of a door shutting. Hard. Photographs followed. Grainy, captured from distance. Subject A exiting a side chapel door, a key glinting in his hand. Next shot, the same chapel, cabinet open, shelves partly empty. The caption scribbled beneath, records missing, likely moved, not destroyed. So the cabinet I was kneeling in front of wasn't the only one. The side archive, the phantom drawers, the holy ground turned vault, pieces of the same invisible warehouse. Then came the dossier's black spine. Thick, unforgiving. Advisory scenarios, containment protocols. Inside, flowcharts of chaos and control. If DNA leak, activate philanthropy campaign. If family link, exposed, invoke privacy rights plus spiritual reconciliation. If mayor resists, withdraw support, elevate deputy candidate. Every outcome mapped, every choice anticipated. The town wasn't being governed. It was being stage managed. One envelope had no title, just grease stains on its corners. Inside was a photograph of a journalist's desk, papers scattered, ashtray full, a half-drunk cup of coffee. On the wall above the desk, pinned among clippings, was a single envelope marked with 3 dots, the same symbol I'd seen before. On Polaroids, on handwritten notes, on transcripts. 3 dots, marching like silent witnesses. Whoever left those marks was everywhere. Not a ghost, but a shadow editor, moving through the systems, press, church, council, transport, like a conductor whose orchestra never saw his face. The last folder was almost blank. A single sheet of paper, typed. Truth delayed becomes myth. Myth delayed becomes law. Law delayed becomes silence. Hinterkaifeck remains, all 3. At the bottom, 2 signatures. One smudged, unreadable. The other chillingly clear, the mayor. I sat back on the cold floor. Around me, the archive breathed with dust and history, but I felt none of its weight. Only the Polaroid still in my hand, the faint image of a note pinned with iron, and the reminder that someone had wanted me here. Someone who left a trail of crosses, deltas, and ellipses for anyone foolish or desperate enough to follow. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a chapter in a crime story. It was a map of complicity, a century-long relay where each generation carried the baton of silence, wrapped in salt and scripture, passed from hand to hand, from graveyard to boardroom. And now, as I looked down at the files, I understood the real curse. Hinterkaifeck wasn't haunted by the victims. It was haunted by the protectors. The killers had swung an axe, but the survivors had built an empire out of the blood. When I closed the box and slid it back into the cabinet, the violet strip of cloth slipped from my hand. It fell to the floor with a soft hiss, like fabric exhaling. I left it there. Some relics don't deserve to be folded neatly back into history. The lights flickered again. The buzzing above stuttered, then steadied. The room looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. Because once you've opened the drawer with the cross, nothing looks the same again. I stood, carrying the Polaroid in my pocket. Somewhere beyond this archive, Subject A was shaking hands, pouring champagne, smiling for cameras. The mayor was still sitting in that chair, spine bent under invisible weight. The press was still typing, deleting, reshaping. The church was still ringing bells that drowned out questions. But I had the image of the nail, the paper pinned, the faint cross, proof that beneath every polished sentence in gold in him, there was still a tack of iron holding silence in place. And tacks can be pulled. That night, when I stepped out of the archive into the square, the air tasted of rain and electricity. The town slept, but in the windows of the parish, a candle still flickered. And in the distance, the low growl of a truck engine rolled across the fields like thunder too tired to flash. For a moment, I thought I heard the newsroom phone ringing again. One single bell, then silence. And I realized the silence was the loudest sound this place had. The modern labyrinth. The 2007 files thickened like tree rings that refused to close around a heart. When I slid out the binder labeled Interdisciplinary Review, the archive changed shape. The ceiling seemed to drop. The fluorescence ticked like a hospital EKG, and the aisles of shelves drew back to reveal a single corridor made of paper. I stepped into it with my eyes first, and then my eyes became shoes, crunching across the consonants. Every page sounded like gravel. The first sheet was a neat org chart: forensics, history, criminal psychology. 3 clean blocks, 3 tidy arrows, 3 promises. On paper they meshed like gears. In my ear they scraped like teeth that never learned each other's bite. I could hear the gap behind the diagrams. A forensic scientist who only trusts what will repeat, a historian who knows the only things that matter never do, and a profiler who studies what no one wants to say out loud. 3 definitions of truth set on a conference table like magnets aligned the wrong way, all pushing back. A minute later the memo said it plain. Proposal: exhumation at Hinterkaifeck. The word exhumation hit the page the way a shovel rings off the lid of a coffin. Below it, a field plan fanned out. Cordons, transects, staging tents, sample routes. In the right margin, a hair-thin pencil hand had asked, "Candle frequency beyond the perimeter?" I saw the field immediately. Young weeds tamped into green fingerprints, a backhoe breathing cold at dawn, the steel tasting the morning, and beyond the police tape, a sea of candles. Not light, gaze. On the beds of flame, I read the copy-paste slogans: "Do not disturb, do not remember, do not stir the ashes." Their peace, filtered through the ear, resolved into silence. Aerial stills were clipped behind the plan. From above, the crowd looked like 2 lungs exhaling at different tempos. One side sang, the other chanted. Between them ran a stitch of dirt track thin as a seam scar. The hymns braided into slogans and then unbraided into noise, like 2 streams meeting and turning whirlpool. The team stood at the bank gripping measuring tapes while the current took the scale marks away. Anonymous letters arrived early, like the first rain. The earth has already swallowed. Whoever digs will be swallowed. No signature, only the grammar of a shadow. I held the page and the damp rose from the paper's hairline. Some threats don't need volume. They borrow the friction of roots below ground. Forensics tried to set its cold sun in the room, the one light science has, and the one that never comforts. Gel images of STRs ran across the table like red-blue sheet music, lanes and bands. Some aligned, some shifted half a beat. The caption was surgical: partial matches with multiple current residents, branch and not excluded. I stared at the bars as if they were blood still traveling. From the stable, through the beatification, across the mine's gala hall, and then stopping under a present-day porch where chalk drawings faded on the concrete. One invisible snip had already cut the village into lines of suspicion. The community psych write-up knocked time into a metronome. Hypervigilance, clumping, hostile inference. Under the words I heard a picket of windows slamming shut in synchrony. Yesterday the neighbors borrowed salt. Today salt was the mine was money, and money was mute. An old woman came back from the market, unpinned her scarf, and admitted someone had looked at her longer than a greeting. Distrust here grew like moss. You didn't see it sprout. You only noticed when the paving stones turned slick. A security camera caught a figure at the archive gate at 2:17. Dark coat, hood up, tall, hands loose, neither hurried nor afraid. The caption was cold, likely surveillance. I watched that silhouette until it slid through decades, fitting over a 1922 suspect at the foot of a ladder, lengthening into a 2007 businessman leaning against a parish wall during a fundraiser. Shadow doesn't age. It only chooses routes. A handwritten shard wedged between reports like a scratch in glass. The maze isn't only on paper. It's built outside. 3 bullet points sat under it with the cruelty of simplicity. Church, enterprise, /mafia, public. 3 arrows aimed at center. At their meeting point, the ink had pooled into a blot. Tilt the page, and the blot became a trapdoor. Then came the folder labeled incidents. No more committees, no more jargon, just holes. Hole 1. A bone sample vanished between the field tent and the lab. The chain of custody read like a receipt ripped through the signatures. I saw the cardboard box riding a conveyor, heard the tape slap shut, and then the sound ended. Some truths aren't disproved, they're eaten. Hole 2. A traffic accident involving the junior reporter. The narrative was brief, the scene photos cropped tight, but one line held. Rear wheel lugs, loosened. I heard metal skidding, wind sawing across a cracked pane, a heart missing beats. The paper called it a personal hiatus. The newsroom reassigned her to missing cats. This is how you silence in daylight. Not by saying hush, but by saying soften. Hole 3. Johan's office, entered. No cash gone, no laptop lifted, only one drawer emptied. There was no prime mark, no forced lock, just a belt of dust wiped clean at the exact reach of an arm. A gloved hand had gone straight to the coordinates and pulled the only map that drew a way out. You don't smash a maze, you pocket its compass. Hole 4. A witness reversed herself. 2 interviews, 2 weathers. In the second, her anchor line snapped. I'm not sure I was ever sure. The word sure fell from the sentence like a tooth. On her back porch, someone had stood and never knocked. There are ways to talk without words. A wide photo of the square was clipped beside it. The caption called it a justice rally, but the faces looked like masks abandoned halfway through the paint job, mouths open, eyes hollowed. 2 mirror crowds shouted the same word, truth, just with different stress. Truth screamed becomes mute. A thick manila envelope weighted with a stamped title, Keykeeper. Old paper, blurred ink, a circular whisper about evidence still extant. No address, no return, no arrangement for reply. The envelope smelled of a damp closet and church varnish. It could have been a prank. Even pranks are walls in a maze. They send you running in circles so you arrive where you started, only more tired. A budget line closed its hand. Funding cut to the team. Reason, public response. In the margin, a pencil had added, business pressure. Money doesn't smash the bulb, it flicks the breaker. In the even dark, science doesn't die, it sleeps. And then they say, we see nothing, therefore there is nothing. A lab addendum filed its caveat. Anomalous STR, possible contamination. Contamination slid through my jaw like grit. I pictured a single drop at the wrong second. A rack swapped one position before the run. Science is tight, but tight is easy to torque if someone's hand is on the right valve. The last line in incidents was the only signpost I trusted. We are playing inside someone else's maze. I left it unclipped, free on the desk like a warning on a highway with no exit. You are not lost. You are being led. The community crisis folder waited underneath, red ink the color of salted blood. The internal DNA memo didn't clear anyone. It implicated everyone. Multiple households not excluded. Every front door now opened onto the same room. Suspicion. The village map in the appendix had roof lines marked with dots, and the dots linked into a vascular diagram. Announce that chart, and you inject the town with its own blood. The splits came on schedule. A kid shoved off the relay lane because of his last name. A butcher sliding a thumb on the scale for the family under rumor. Pews shifting a half-hand's breadth between 2 rows, piety measured in bone. In an hour, the case stopped being past tense and installed itself like software in the present. The OS rebooted. Language lagged behind. Meeting notes. A town hall turned shove. A table split, some blood, the lights hiccuping in and out. I heard a collar tear, and beneath the cotton lived an old scar. Maybe work, maybe fights, now paraded as evidence. The community played courtroom without a judge. A clipped headline chimed in. Bavaria split by Hinterkaifeck. The copy was short, the tale was long, an ad for winter travel tucked under it. Justice stuck between weather and a discount. The letters had been brined for shelf life. A police memo followed, vigilante rumors. I heard a knife kissed once by a whetstone, shoe soles whispering over wet stone, a dry mouth repeating the name that needed quieting. When justice twitches, violence speaks in a grammar made of bodies. The clinic sent its own graph, spikes in sleeplessness and dread. White pills counted like salt. The rattling of bottles was thin rain against tin. The case had become a pressure system sitting on a chest. People dropped asleep like falling, woke like jerking. Near the back was a nameless scrap. In a maze with no exit, whoever keeps walking becomes a wall. I saw them take their places. The young officer from 22, the old chief from 55, the mayor from 07. Each stepping into a corridor and stopping, each cooling from a person into masonry, so the next generation could brush their shoulders and feel the chill. I added myself to the row, a new panel, still warm with the smell of paper. I closed the folder, but the room kept making its noises, roots rubbing, candle crackle, the tick of a loosened lug, a crowd learning to amplify itself. Around me, modern walls had risen. Church wall, non-name business wall, media wall, lineage wall, budget wall, anxiety wall. I stood in the middle with a single match labeled interdisciplinary inquiry. If I struck it, the smoke might arrive before the flame. Something thin slid from a sleeve. A note in an unfamiliar slanted hand. Don't look for exits. Look for where the wall lies. I pocketed it. That was the only charm worth keeping in a city of slogans. A thought surfaced like wood under brine. A maze is built to protect one door. Not seeing a door doesn't mean there isn't one. Sometimes you're leaning on it without hearing the hinges. Overhead, the fluorescent popped, a period at the end of the sentence. I didn't shut the binder. I just pulled its cover half forward, leaving a mouth of paper to breathe. Cold air spilled from the gap and carried the faintest smell of wood. The side shelving in the chapel, the one the Polaroid from Chapter 5 had already named. If the cross scratch still exists, it might be the knot that cinches every string. I left the desk with 3 things in my hands: an unfinished DNA run, a crowd map, and a sentence that turns people into walls. All 3 weighed almost nothing, but together they pushed one brick in my head half a millimeter out of place. Half a millimeter is enough. When a wall lies, it cracks without sound. You smell it first. At the door, the clock blinked 2:19, neat as a keyway. I knew I'd be back at the side shelf, not to solve the maze, but to find the one brick that talks. In places where phones don't work, paper still hears. I returned to the archive before the night was finished, before the world could decide whether to release a dawn. The room lay like a deep basin, its surface still as water until touched. I switched on only the desk lamp, letting the darkness keep its dreams. The smell was sharp and mixed: ink, cloth, brittle paste, old skin on cardboard. Papers breathe if you give them time. The register of relic storage led me like a map. The handwriting was almost microscopic, caviar small, until one line blinked like a loose pixel. Annex B/SCH 1922/relics. A forgotten side shelf for liturgical objects removed during a chapel renovation. A faint pencil slash in the margin, maybe a clerk's idle tick, maybe a breadcrumb. Either way, it was alive. The side shelf hid behind a heavy map cabinet. When I pushed it, the casters hummed like an animal rearranging its nest. The shelf revealed itself: gray boxes with silver tape, labels embossed into plastic so cold they looked like grave tags. I picked the third box from the top. The fabric strip was rough, a corner stiff as a grain caught in a tooth. I tugged. Inside, a torn altar cloth, a wooden clip grayed to driftwood, a hand-sewn sack. I opened the sack. Chalk dust rose like a sigh. At the bottom, 2 Polaroids. The first, a wide shot of the chapel dais beside the saint statue. The second, a close frame of the wood at its base. There, barely visible, was a carving, a fishhook crossing with a hurried H. No caption, just time itself drawing in mold. I raised the photos into the yellow light. The incision was not deep, only scored in paint, meaning it was newer than the platform. New enough to be post-war, maybe even post-millennium. The carving wasn't for parishioners, it was for archivists. Behind me, the room held its breath. Sweat prickled my scalp though the air was cold. If this was a sign, it was a sign left for whoever touched these files. A thin note was pinned between the photos. Look down, not up. It stung in its bluntness. Parishioners prayed with eyes to heaven. In 1955, shame had bent them downward. In 2007, truth demanded a posture lower than faith. The statue raised its gaze. The answer hid at its feet. Cross-reference with the site coordination plan made the pattern worse. Ground-penetrating radar was to grid the meadow, tiny black dots marked gas pockets. But in the corner was a hand-drawn arrow at the chapel. Concrete overlay, 1962. Core drill. I could already hear the whine of a bit biting through cement, the hollow tone where the machine hit air, the wooden echo from beneath the stone. The electromagnetic survey had registered anomalies. A crescent of metal the size of a palm caught between floorboards. Blurred photos showed its edge rubbed shiny, as if once looped to a chain. It rhymed with the hook, the H, the wooden clip. Lock, key, anchor. Something once hung there, then was hidden. A secret was buried not outside in the dirt, but inside the prayer. A minor incident in the field logs mentioned spilled wax revealing a fissure across the dais. A crack traced from the pedestal to the floor seam. Wax, lock, crack, hollow. Each clue resisted a sentence. Together they spelled a command. I refused to pronounce it. The internal memo confirmed. Ground penetration postponed due to parish protests. Below that, alternate access via 1938 service tunnel. The blueprint showed the tunnel truncated under the word Hinterkaifeck, a door drawn in ink with a side mark, external padlock. I could hear the rasp of a hinge already drying to dust. Suddenly the files shifted tone. Reports turned brusque, brawls, break-ins, line item sabotage. The maze had finished construction. Only one thing mattered, finding the wall that lied. Walls lie in decoration, wax, ribbons, white cloth, PAX banners. In one chapel photo, the drape fell asymmetrical, left side longer than right by the width of a finger. A wink, if you knew how to watch fabric. One side note admitted what no one wanted public. Elder acolyte recalls. Dais foundation raised after war. Raised why? To hide or protect. Candles beautify changes, but they also distort shadows. If the shadow no longer matched the statue was not where it belonged. I folded the folder, but in my head a new constellation shone. Chapel, dais, crescent clasp, crack, tunnel, shelf. H. Not a story, not yet. Just a star chart glimpsed at the 1 hour it aligns. I wasn't solving, I was overhearing. The architecture was talking through millimeters, wax streaks, silences in the margins. The DNA printout returned to my table. A misaligned stripe overlapped. A pencil ghost noted. Sample once swapped deliberately. Erased later, but the graphite bruise still visible. This was an error. It was fear disguised as correction. In a labyrinth, correct letters light up like beacons. Fearful ones survive by dimness. Another psychology note. Memory contagion effect. Memories salted themselves into skin, spreading when bodies pressed too close. In 2007, the candle marchers weren't only believers. They were wearers of memory, garments of salt. Opponent or supporter, everyone was soaked. Salt burns conceal salt burns. That's why institutions want crowds. Burn hides sting. Budget anomalies whispered too. The official line, funds cut due to backlash. But the ledger miscounted by 0.5%. Tiny, yet large enough to buy fatigue. That slice rerouted to local security. The chapel gate shone brighter. The centrifuge spun slower. A labyrinth runs on fractions. I stopped to listen. The heater exhaled, a ballpoint dripped ink. My throat swallowed dry. In between those noises came another. Light steps across the roof. Not the farmhouse loft of 1922, but the steel ceiling of this archive. I didn't look up. Looking up is how people vanish. Instead, I pressed one finger to the Polaroid, like pressing a piano key. The footsteps quit. At the bottom of the stack was a crisis brief. Smooth tone, round words. Engage the parish. Dialogue with the press. Transparency with stakeholders. But under worst-case scenario was the blunt line. Suspend exhumation if violence escalates. Which means the candles only had to topple in numbers large enough. Justice here wouldn't be defeated. It would be tired into sleep. Fatigue, too, is a weapon. The slip of paper still lay in my palm. Look down, not up. A command, not advice. It had been waiting decades for a reader. I tucked it into my pocket, like a contraband charm. Whoever left it knew the labyrinth wasn't meant to be escaped. It was meant to be endured, bent, carried. And the only crack in the walls would be at the floor, where most never bothered to look. I stacked my fragments on the desk. Layer 1, chapel photos, the hooked H, the crescent of metal. Layer 2, the floor fissure, the service tunnel, the side shelf. Layer 3, misaligned DNA, 0.5% missing budget, erasures made in fear. Overlaid, the 3 layers formed an arch. And at the top of the arch, a pinhole. Not a door to heaven, a stitch hole. Something had been sewn shut. The question was, with whose hand? I scrawled in the margin of my own notebook, letters so small they looked ashamed. Breaking point, the dais. Not because it promised a body or gold or a weapon, but because it tied together 3 ropes: church, commerce, family. Cut that knot, and the labyrinth wouldn't collapse. It would rotate. A new passage might open, a breath might return to the village. I placed the relic sack back in its box. My nail snagged the rough seam. A single thread had been added, thicker, newer, out of place. A later hand had stitched it in. Not the hand of a conspirator or a profiteer, but of someone siding with the paper itself. The stitch was an act of mercy, proof that the labyrinth didn't want to eat everyone, proof that even paper had allies. The hour outside shifted from black to bruise. I cut the lamp. Dawn painted the red vitrolage on the file cover into a softer brown, the way secrets mellow but never fade. The room smelled of 2 centuries at once: salt, wood, candle smoke, carbon toner. I laid my palm flat on the cover, as if pressing on a chest. If the case had a heartbeat, it pulsed under the statue, under the accounts, under the erasures. Not one pulse, but many, out of rhythm, all claiming to be truth. I tapped once, softly, on the desk. The wood answered hollow, not with words, but with breath. It was enough. I left the archive slowly, steps careful not to write anything new into the dust. On the landing, I looked back. The crack of light under the door looked like a thread someone had dropped. I didn't pick it up. Every maze needs crumbs for whoever comes next. Outside, the city exhaled. Mist glazed the railings like sweat after a nightmare. Hammers rang from a construction site across the square, each strike echoing with the suppressed cough of the chapel waiting for mass. Nobody looked at me. That was good. The reader of the file must not become its character. Characters never get to choose their endings. I slipped into a narrow lane. The wall was mottled with moss, a green map of water routes. Above, a security camera turned, its lens slow and black. I lifted my chin half an inch, then remembered the note. Looked down. At my feet, a cobblestone had risen on one side, worn smooth by countless fingertips. In its crack, a glint of metal. Curved, crescent, almost a twin of the buried clasp. Maybe only a coin. Maybe part of the same lock, spat up by rain. I didn't touch it. I stood there, listening. The sound was faint, almost imaginary. A fissure running through the labyrinth's wall, like a joint cracking after too much stillness. Not a collapse, just a reminder that walls are not eternal. That was enough. My part in this chapter ended here. The modern labyrinth had shown its architecture. Walls made of crowds, corridors made of percentages, locks made of chapels, traps made of DNA. Its exit, if it had one, was small, disguised as trivia. Whoever sought glory would miss it. Whoever paid attention to millimeters and half-shadows might survive long enough to find it. I moved on with nothing but a short list in my notebook and a new habit, pressing my ear to the ground before believing any wall. Chapter 7. The 3-Generation Loop. The last folder was heavier than the others, its cover thick and rough, bound not by one seal, but by 3. 1922, 1955, and 2007. They looked less like wax than like doorways, stacked atop one another. Behind each, a silhouette waited. The first pages were a journal from 1922. The handwriting leaned forward, the ink blurred. Some lines trembled, as if the hand holding the pen could barely stay steady. That night, I heard footsteps in the attic. I did not go up. The air around me shifted. The wooden farmhouse rose out of the paper. Damp hay whined through the boards, the black weight of rafters above. A young officer stood in the kitchen doorway, lantern in hand, its glow shaking with his breath. His eyes lifted, his ears strained. The creak of a board came from above. One step more, and he could have opened the attic door. But his foot stayed rooted. The lantern flared, then faltered, and he turned away. That instant sealed more than the Hinterkaifeck murders. It sealed the fate of his line. A later line in the journal. I let the darkness live one more night. The sentence felt carved into timber. I could hear his heart hammering, and another beat above. The intruders, or his own terror multiplied. The two rhythms merged into a single dread that would never end. The official report was typed and neat, but on the margin a blot of ink swelled, almost like a teardrop pressed into the fibers. I imagined the young man sitting at a desk, hands stiff, writing with the voice of objectivity while in his mind, he still heard blood dripping onto stable straw. The sound never made it into the report, but it lived in every line. Another note. No weapon recovered. I heard the hiss of wind through the barn, saw the heap of bodies under hay. The officer stood nearby, notebook clenched, eyes fixed but unmoving. The weapon had disappeared, as if the ground itself had swallowed it. And with his hesitation, The earth swallowed his courage too. I closed the 1922 section, but the young officer remained in the room. His face was not old, but his eyes carried an age beyond years. The age of a burden that would pass to his son, then his grandson, then to me, just by reading. The second layer bore the date 1955. The typed pages were cleaner, steadier, but the margins betrayed them. Handwritten scrawls, thick, hurried strokes that broke the neat rhythm like a heart under stress. At the top, supplementary investigation, Hinterkaifeck. But below the header, it wasn't only a report. It was a muffled cry, 30 years suppressed. The police chief in 1955, son of the officer from 1922, wrote, "I understand why father did not climb the stairs. I hear the sounds too, but now they are on the roof of my mind." I pictured him at his desk, lamp yellowing the walls, window closed against a night thick with silence. The roof above was empty, yet inside his head the boards creaked in rhythm. Not footsteps of men, but the inheritance of obsession. Another entry, hand trembling. My father missed his chance. I do not want to miss mine. Yet each time I open the file, I feel I miss again. The words bled into one another. He wanted to break silence with record keeping, but paper only built a different kind of silence. Stacked sheets like bricks in a wall between him and the truth. A newspaper clipping was attached. Police chief reopens old wounds of village. I imagined him reading it at dinner, family silent, food cold. Outside, neighbors whispered, half scorn, half fear. To them, he was not a seeker of justice, but a grave digger of the past. And in that humiliation, he finally understood his father's torment. Not failure to find the killer, but failure to withstand the gaze of a community eager to bury truth. A note in smeared ink. Justice is not catching a murderer. Justice is refusing to let them be forgotten. I felt the pounding of his heart, each beat like a fist against brick. His concept of justice had mutated, no longer arrest, but memory. Yet memory is a war no man can win alone. I turned another page. A report from that same year mentioned a threatening letter signed the keeper of the key. The handwriting, jagged, echoed almost exactly a letter from 2007. I shivered. It was not one man writing. It was tradition itself. Threats were passed down like scripture, generation to generation. In the 2007 file, the mayor, grandson of the police chief, had underlined that phrase. I imagined him alone in an archive room, reading the threat his grandfather once read, tapping his pen against the desk in defeat. He had technology, authority, and modern science. Yet he too was trapped in the same circle: letters, rumors, ridicule. Each generation thought it held a new key, but the key was the same: rusted, useless, incapable of opening any door. The 1955 folder ended, but its echo pressed into my chest. Father, hesitant in 1922. Son, haunted in 1955. Now, the grandson in 2007 faced the same weight, a century's worth of silence shaped into law. The final layer bore his title in bold black ink: Mayor, Decision. Touching the page felt like laying a hand on a door not to a room, but to a shaft without bottom. The transcript of an emergency meeting began with bureaucratic phrases, cold as iron. The Hinterkaifeck matter has caused division. The mayor must declare a public position. In my mind, the council chamber appeared. High ceiling, lights bright as interrogation, a circle of chairs polished to indifference. The mayor sat at the center, palms flat on the table. Around him flickered shadows, professors, journalists, clergy, business leaders, stretching long across the walls like accusing fingers. But he did not meet their eyes. He looked through the files stacked in front of him and saw his grandfather's hand in shaky ink, his father's blot of shame, and his own reflection layered atop both. A note scrawled sideways in the margin: I understand, Father. Father understood grandfather. None of us escaped. I heard it, not as words, but as 3 heartbeats falling into sync. 1922, 1955, 2007. They drummed in unison, one chest to another, one generation's hesitation pulsing inside the next. The DNA report was attached, stamped with clinical precision. Genetic markers consistent with family A. Cannot determine perpetrator. On paper, the language was neutral. In air, it sounded like a laugh. Technology had promised revelation. but instead it drew another corridor in the maze. The mayor, armed with politics and science, still found himself at a wall with no door. Another page, political pressure increasing. Opposition party demands resignation. I heard the council hall crackle with noise, gavels pounding, papers slapped down, chairs scraping. It was no different from the sneers of 1955 or the whispers of 1922. The music of ridicule played in every era, a song the village knew by heart. Tucked inside was a fragment in his own handwriting. If I release the files, I lose my office. If I stay silent, I betray father and grandfather. Which crime is heavier? I saw him alone at his desk, lamp cutting a narrow circle of light. His silhouette stretched long across the wall, merging with two others. His father at the same desk, his grandfather frozen in the farmhouse doorway, lantern trembling. Three shadows elongated, braided into one. A clipping from a tabloid crowned the folder. Mayor haunted by Hinterkaifeck ghosts. The headline was black soot smeared on paper. The villagers devoured it in beer halls, at market stalls, at Sunday gatherings. For them, he was not a man, but another act in a century-old play. His family line was the script, his failure their entertainment. In that moment he understood, justice does not die because killers vanish. It dies because crowds laugh. His final note was barely legible, ink splintered where the pen shook. I will sign. Not because I believe in justice, but because silence ensures the loop never ends. The sound of pen against paper echoed in my ear, dry and final. It was less a decision than a sigh passed down through bloodlines. The grandfather's missed step, the father's failed pursuit, the grandson's fractured resolve, all fused into that scratch of ink. But even with the signature, the maze did not collapse. It simply shifted shape, from secrecy to exposure, from hidden shame to public spectacle. The labyrinth lived on, hungry for another generation. When I closed the folder, I did not feel it close. The three men remained, standing shoulder to shoulder. Young officer, weary chief, broken mayor. Each held out a fragment of paper. Each offered it to me. I took them. And in that act, I stepped into the line. The room clock struck 12. Each chime was not time passing but the pulse of the maze itself, beating inside me now. Midnight had ended, but the air inside the archive felt heavier, as though time had chosen to pause inside these walls. I sat alone with the folder closed, yet its weight remained on my chest like a stone. Grandfather, father, grandson, all three still standing before me, silent. All three handing me their failures like torches that burned without light. I rose and returned to the shelves. The faintest scratch of wood echoed as I slid the box back into place, but my hand lingered, unwilling to let go. On the edge of the file sat a thin slip of paper, one I had not noticed before. It bore only 4 words, penciled faintly. Do not look up. I thought immediately of the Polaroids from the side annex, of the hook-shaped carving beside the letter H etched under the saint's pedestal, of the note tucked behind them that whispered the same warning, look down. The message was repeated through decades, like a commandment written by invisible hands. My grandfather ignored it in 1922, lifting his lantern toward the ceiling instead of the floor. My father in 1955 searched upward into public scrutiny and ridicule, never downward into the dirt. And the mayor in 2007 tilted his gaze to the crowd, to opinion polls, to political ceilings that pressed down on him, never to the ground beneath his feet. The loop was not only familial, it was vertical. Each generation looked upward, and in that gesture, missed what had been hidden underfoot. I retrieved the envelope of photographs again, my fingers trembling though I told myself it was the chill. The second Polaroid, the one that magnified the pedestal's base, seemed almost alive now. The hooked line and the letter H, etched shallow into the painted wood, glared at me like a pupil. It was not a dedication. It was not graffiti. It was an arrow disguised as a letter, a direction mistaken for ornament. In my mind, I saw the house of 1922, rickety and black in lantern light. My grandfather pausing on the staircase, the boards groaning under his boots, his fear lifting his eyes toward the attic instead of downward at the floor that might have revealed a hidden hatch. I saw my father, decades later, standing in his office, rereading the files so many times that the ceiling seemed to lower over him, pressing him into paralysis. And I saw the grandson, the mayor, watching the crowd's faces above the candlelight, never daring to kneel and feel the cracks spreading under his own shoes. The maze was not designed to be walked in straight lines. It demanded a change of posture. To crawl, to kneel, to bow. I pressed the photograph flat against the table, then drew from memory the other fragments. The half-moon scrap of metal lodged between planks, the loose thread of fabric sewn into the storage bag, the note about the post-war foundation poured under the chapel pedestal. One by one, they aligned like constellations. Hook, half-moon, H. A key shape, crude but unmistakable. And suddenly, I remembered the phrase in my father's journal. The key was never missing. It was hidden in the lock itself. He had written it as metaphor. Or maybe he had seen what I was only now daring to piece together. The files around me blurred into one another. Press clippings, DNA graphs, threats scrawled in pencil. They were noise, all of them. But these carved lines and fragments were not noise. They were a code passed through silence. I stood, the chair scraping like a coffin lid behind me. My breath misted in the cold air. The shelf against the far wall seemed to wait. Behind it, the annex with its forgotten relics. The Polaroid had pointed me once. Now it pointed again. The three men, my family's ghosts, did not speak, but I felt them leaning, watching. This was the turn they had never taken. I placed the final note, the mayor's shaky admission, "I will sign," on top of the file stack. The ink shimmered faintly under the desk lamp, still damp in my imagination, as though the decision had been made only minutes ago. I whispered, to no one and everyone, "Then I will not sign. I will look down." And with that, I bent. I pressed my ear against the archive floor, wood chilled and bitter beneath my skin. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faint as breath through teeth, the hollow answer came. A cavity beneath the boards. The maze had spoken. The curtain falls. The final file had no red seal, no hardcover. Only a frayed string, tied loosely, as if the throat of truth had tried to close around a sentence but never managed to speak it. When I touched it, the string quivered faintly, like a heartbeat unsure it still belonged to anyone. Inside were not reports or test results, just fragments. Half a damp page, a blurred photograph, an unfinished note. The leftovers, the refuse that rules and record-keeping had pushed aside. And if truth likes to hide anywhere, it is usually in the seams. The first scrap, an interrogation log from 1922, cut off mid-sentence. The pen had been yanked away, ink smeared like a bruise. The last words legible. Suspect number 4 could not explain the footprint. Due to pressure, the file closed. That word closed sat on the page like a stone over a well. To passers-by, the surface looked flat, safe. But below, the water still murmured. The next image, a funeral, 1955. The police chief's coffin lowered into the ground, wreaths piled high. Among the mourners stood a young man, the future mayor. He stared down at the dirt, where a dark streak stretched out beneath his shoes. It was not a shadow. It was a dry line of blood reaching out from the past to touch him. From that day forward, he never stepped outside the story again. Then a note from Johann, 2007. There is new evidence, but not strong enough to release. Science here had not failed for lack of light. The light itself had been shaken by the wind. Each time one corner was illuminated, the shadows slid elsewhere. Tucked in the middle was a trial print for a headline. Bold letters screamed, "Who was the real killer?" But the column beneath was blank, filled only with rows of question marks. I could almost hear the clatter of a typewriter, then the silence when the ribbon dried out. The press had stood at the mouth of the maze, scribbled the question, then collapsed before the answer. And then, an unsigned scrap. Stop searching. The killer is all of us. The ink had blurred as though the page had been caught in rain. The line did not plead for forgiveness. It lifted a mirror. And in the mirror stood not only the hand that swung an axe, but also the hands that rang the church bell, signed the budget, printed the headlines, carried the candles, and kept silent. Murder was not only an act, it was a structure. I spread the fragments across the desk, letting them arrange themselves. Out of disorder rose a new labyrinth, the labyrinth of theories. Each one was a hallway with its own scent. Damp hay, newsprint ink, salt, candle wax, dry metal. I walked them one by one, listening to the echoes. Hallway 1, land. A scrap mentioned boundary disputes, maybe motive. I saw the Hinterkaifeck fields, Crooked fence posts, two men squaring off. A slammed fist, a chair scraping, an axe pulled from the wall. The path was direct, logical. But at the end, the wall stood bare. No weapon found, no confession made. Only the wind across empty furrows, footprints swallowed by mud. Hallway 2. Honor. A whisper of forbidden relations. Behind curtains, stifled breath, a glance of shame. A hand pressed to a stomach, eyes terrified of becoming a rumor. The door burst open, shadows surged in. A domestic crime, clean and fast, with no outsiders needed. Yet at the far wall, there was only a red stain with no name. Hallway 3. The Stranger. An old police memo, itinerant thieves. I walked the dirt lane at night, dogs barking, rafters creaking overhead. A faceless drifter staying for days, eating from the pantry, feeding livestock as though he owned them. The theory was easy to sell, comforting in its simplicity. But at the end, a hook snagged me. Why would he linger, risk capture, after the blood was spilled? The wall there answered with embarrassed silence. Hallway 4. Family and Salt. The 2007 file strung connections together. Land rights, charitable funds, newspaper ads, cutting a ribbon whose father had been suspect number 4. Photographs layered, dark suits covering coarse shirts. A dynasty washed white in salt, standing on red ground. At the final wall, familiar words painted in legal ink. Suspicion only. No conclusion. The wall had been whitewashed by law itself. Hallway 5. The Village. A psychological report muttered, contagious memory syndrome. The village became a closed circle. Every window shuttered, every head bowed. No one killed, yet everyone kept the stone pressed over the well. I walked endlessly, no walls to stop me. Only curves that led me back to where I started. In this theory, there was no murderer to name. The murderer was the air. I stepped back, standing at the crossroads of 5 hallways. Each smelled of blood, each echoed with whispers. None led to an open door. All looped back to the same question, older than the church beams themselves. I gathered the fragments again. On the back of the file cover, faint pencil marks rose under the lamp. Who was the killer? I touched it, graphite smeared onto my finger like dried blood refusing to wash away. At the edge of the desk, one sheet remained, a blank conclusion form. Its stamp had faded, leaving only an empty white space where a single name could be written. Around me, I felt 3 generations breathing. 1922, heavy with hay. 1955, heavy with leather-bound journals. 2007, heavy with printer ink. They looked at me from the mirror, waiting. If I wrote a name, the loop would close neatly, like a story tied with a ribbon. If I left it blank, the loop would keep breathing, an open wound. The knife was not in the axe. The knife was in the decision, to publish or to bury. And whoever made that choice was the true killer of justice. I turned the last scrap, and there it was again. Look down, not up. The warning had followed me across chapters. Look down, into the pedestal cracks, the 0.5% missing from budgets, the uneven wax drips, the odd thread sewn into a bag, the cobblestone corner chipped by too many fingers. Everywhere I had bent, the hollow had answered. I pressed my ear against the desk. From deep below, a cavity answered, this time not beneath a chapel floor, but beneath the very word conclusion. The blankness of the page was not emptiness. It was deliberate, carved to echo. I held the pen. Ink pooled at the nib, cold, ready. Outside, wind struck the glass 3 times, as though reminding me the maze stretched far beyond these walls. I lifted my head just enough not to forget to bow. The nib touched paper. I did not write. The string binding the file quivered, humming like a stringed instrument waiting to be plucked. If I wrote a name, the string would snap, sound made, then gone. If I left it blank, the string would go on trembling, a frail heartbeat, but alive. On the shelves, thousands of other files sat waiting. Each one a door, each one whispering. Not only Hinterkaifeck. Every village, every time where silence had been chosen over confrontation. The church bell outside struck 3. Slowly, deeply, each toll a generation. Grandfather, father, grandson. Their silence weighed on me not as absence, but as inheritance. I turned back to the blank form. White. Yet under the lamp, shadows of erased words shimmered faintly. H/footprint/community. Half gone, half returned, like stains scrubbed 100 times. A final scrap slid to the floor. I picked it up. A scrawl, ink nearly dry. Reveal or bury, either way it cuts. The one who chooses the blade is the killer. And I knew then, the question was never in the file. The question was in the hand holding it. Whoever opens it becomes part of the crime. Whoever declares a theory drags blood into daylight. Whoever stays silent lets the darkness feed. Both stain the hand. I looked once more at the blank page. The pen still heavy. I did not write a name. Because the conclusion was not a line of text. It was the mirror the paper had become. And in that mirror, my reflection blurred away, until only yours remained. The file asked you, as it had asked me, as it had asked every generation, who is the killer? And the answer waits, not in ink, but in your choice.